All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace to all of you. I am joined here today with two friends, two atheists, who hopefully will be somewhat unbiased in this discussion. Of course, I mean, everybody has their own biases, but I figured I'd bring two people here who are not Muslim, not Christian, and hopefully we'll be able to analyze some of the debate in an unbiased fashion. But for people who don't know you guys, this is Danny and also Friction. I don't know if you guys want to introduce yourselves in any other detailed way.
Yeah, my name is Danny. I have a channel that I haven't uploaded in a while, but I tend to talk to Christians. I tend to give objections against Christianity. I used to be a Christian. I've been thinking about the logic / metaphysics of the Trinity for almost a decade very seriously, and I enjoy the topic. I have a little bit of a background in philosophy academically, so that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Okay, how about you, Friction?
Yeah, I'm Troy. I run a YouTube channel called Friction. It's not really concerned with a lot of this, these religious topics, but some of that stuff does come up. It's mostly a philosophy channel. I interview philosophers on their work and expertise and produce other philosophy content. But yeah, that's mostly it.
Okay, cool. And you guys are not being paid here, paid to agree with me or anything. In fact, right before we went live, we didn't really have any detailed discussion about preparation for this. I said you guys are happy if, and totally free to disagree with me if there's anything I say or any criticisms of me throughout the debate. In fact, I have some criticisms of myself, but maybe we'll get to that. But mostly what I want to do is I want to review Nick's portions in what he said in his opening statement, his kind of response to my argument. I'm not even going to waste my time playing my opening statement because it's very clear in my own head. So anything I have to kind of say about that, we can go through. And yeah, we can kind of work through this. I don't know if preliminarily you want to say anything before I play Nick's opening statement, or you just want to go straight into it?
I'm fine with going straight into it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, straight into it.
Let me just share my screen here.
Up here.
All right, so we're going to go to Nick's opening. It's not that long. I think it's only like 5 minutes. So it'll help us break this down. Let's take a listen.
Let me see. Let me make sure I can
able to make it a little bit bigger.
Yeah, it's not coming bigger. Is there a? What are you sharing? All right. So 10-minute opening statement from Nick. Will start the timer on your first word, and then I'll give you that 1 minute cue. So whenever you're ready.
Cool. All right. Topic of the debate, guys, is the Trinity illogical? I won't make this opening super long as I'm simply defending my position, showing what it is, etc. Oops, let me go ahead on that. All right, so what does it mean for something to be illogical in the first place? Well, as standardly defined in classical logic, for something to be illogical or logically inconsistent, it means there is no model under which every member is true without it being a contradiction in the set. And that's just classically defined everywhere. You can read that at the SEP or really any site that has the definitions of classical logic on it. Now, given that definition, what my opponent's going to have to show is that the model that I give regarding the Trinity is logically inconsistent and that it actually has an error within it that cannot be solved. A couple of things my opponent cannot do is if my opponent tries to argue about the actual properties of the person, such as what makes the person distinct or asking how do we discern them, that would fall into error, as logical consistency has to do with the model. It is not concerned with the metaphysics of what actually makes them distinct. If I can create a consistent model using first-order logic and he agrees it is consistent, he has conceded the debate that it is logical. If it is metaphysically consistent is another topic. So all this means, guys, is there's a difference between the metaphysics of something and the logic of something. Now, the specific set of statements that are regarding in this which we'll try to model, is going to be there exists an Fs and Hs, that there are 3 of these, and that they are 1G yet not each other. So this model is saying that the F is obviously going to stand for Father, S, Son, HS, Holy Spirit, etc. And these are 1G. So they're one God, yet they're not the same person. This model is not concerned with the properties of predicates themselves. So what are the properties of F, S, and HS is irrelevant to the actual model, but are instead concerned if the statement can lead to a consistent model itself. So how do we formulate this? Well, we formulate these statements using relative identity operator, meaning that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are the same G, but they're not the same P, meaning that they're going to be one in one way, but yet distinct in another way. One possible objection that my opponent might give is he might say this way of counting is ad hoc. Although I don't believe it is, even if we granted this counting method is ad hoc, it would not prove the formulation to be logically inconsistent, as models do not care about ad hocness, rather they care if the formulation actually works itself. Another possible objection is he might say that if we count another way, it would lead to a contradiction. This would again fail because even if that is true, as long as this model is consistent, we have met the criteria to be considered logical. To show a counterexample in this, if a Christian were to tell a Muslim, God is merciful, so that means that G equals M or God equals mercy, that would be ill-formed, given that a Muslim commitment about what is means. And so we can show there's multiple different models in which we can use to show that just saying that something is something or something that it equals another doesn't necessarily prove what type of identity you're using there. And so we can formulate it such as this. And that's the end of the slide, and we're all good to go.
All right. So there you have it. That was his opening statement. It was actually short, even shorter than I thought. For people who don't know, the format was supposed to be 10-minute opening statements. You don't necessarily have to take all of the time, but most, skilled debaters make sure they use all of the time that they can. So I thought that was a little weird. Like his opening was, I don't know, like 3 minutes, something like that. It was really short. But the main things that he mentioned, obviously he gave his own definition of logical, which I think he was getting from SEP, or at least that's what he was claiming anyway. What did you guys think about his definition of what it means for something to be logical?
You can go just right now. Say something.
So, yeah, there's different senses of when we say something is logical or illogical. We might have somewhat different things in mind. So one sense of logical is just something about formal consistency. Like if you express these statements as in some language, whether someone accepts that language or not, express it in some language, it might be consistent in the relevant formal system. If there's no contradiction you can derive from it, that's perfectly fine. That's some sense of logical, right? In the sense that it's not contradictory in some system. But and maybe this should have been cleared up more than it was in the debate. When we talk about something being illogical, sometimes we don't just mean something like that, right? And there's a further question of whether the sentences here that are formally consistent on some formal system are meaningfully relevant to what people actually claim, especially as it relates to authoritative creeds and texts about the Trinity. So I will get into this more, but I don't think it's correct to say that just because, look, here I can use the symbols for Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and relative to this system and this expression of the relevant doctrines and sentences in that system, that they're consistent in that system. That's not enough, I think, for us to say that the Trinity is logical in a more relevant sense. I mean, in the same way that I could say, look, take his whole argument. I could say the three of us are the same person, but different beings. Okay. Is that logical? I think all of us will want to say in some sense, no, it's not, right? Even though I could give the exact same defense that he gave in defense of that being quote unquote logical, because I could express all those statements in some system, which would make it consistent, right? I just think that's a kind of Pyrrhic victory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, they're often when people use the word illogical too, they're expressing some kind of conceptual set of problems. Like if you formalize the statement, I am unmarried, that statement, and then the statement that I am a husband, if you formalize those two statements, you're not going to be able to derive a contradiction in first order logic from the formalization of those two statements. Yet it's very natural and quite reasonable to use the term that those two statements are inconsistent in some, that they're illogical, right? So there's a certain sense of, yes, right, illogical that's at play, and especially knowing the background, your background, and people that are often making objections to the LPT, right? To define illogical in that sense, when you know what your debate opponent means by illogical and the context of people offering the LPT, right, is to, I think, to frame the debate in a malformed way. Also, if I could share my screen for just a second, I want to share a quote from Bo Branson. And while I'm sharing, it's been a while since I've used StreamYard, so I want to share my screen, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And then hopefully I get the window here. I'm looking for my window. Give me a second. The Chrome tab. Let's have to share my entire screen. Okay, so I'm sharing now. Hopefully you can see. Okay, good. So here, this is Bo Branson. And he says this on page, I believe this is page 14 of his dissertation. So in any debate over the formal consistency of a set of propositions P, the real work and matter of debate, ironically, does not lie so much in proving the formal consistency or consistency of any statements, but in finding a suitable artificial language L and a suitable representation phi such that it can be shown. But the point is that that a lot of the work or discussions about the LPT isn't just looking for this kind of formal consistency that's defined according to Branson. And you might say, well, why care? I can stop sharing my screen now. Okay. Why care about what Branson says? Well, part of it, remember, there's a sort of I think my thing cut out. There's a context of objecting to the Trinity. There's a way that we use LPT. There's the way that we object to the Trinity. And it's not just we're not just simply looking for or objecting to the sort of formal inconsistencies that some Trinitarian models have, right? And I think that that kind of goes to show that maybe we're a little bit out of touch. That is to say, Nick is a little bit out of touch about what sorts of arguments we're bringing against the doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you guys. Some people were saying that maybe prior to the debate, we should have agreed on a definition of logical and what was actually at stake. But unfortunately, I mean, many times, Danny, you would probably know that when these debates are agreed upon, it's hard enough to agree on a debate title, and then you're not really defining all of the terms prior to the debate and getting an agreement. That's kind of usually it's hashed out for better or worse. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good thing, but it's typically hashed out in the actual debate. So yeah, if all we mean by logical is the very strict and narrow definition and conception that that Nick gave, then all different sorts of models of the Trinity would be logical, not just what he presented, but that's just trivially true, right? Like it's not, at least for what you guys are saying and my position as well, it's not anything interesting, right? Like it doesn't really have much force or weight to say, well, the Trinity is logical in this very narrow sense and way that we're defining things. Whereas the way that I'm looking at it and whether or not it's logical or illogical is whether or not it makes sense, right? In a sort of much simpler way, whether or not it's rational to believe in it and actually going into the metaphysics of what the Trinity is supposed to be. So yeah, I mean, I think we're pretty much all in agreement there, but I think that was the major hang up and difference between Nick's approach and my approach all throughout the debate. But he thinks that, you just get victory based on that. And what I said to him during the debate and also after, like, I've been saying this, I've been talking about this subject publicly for, I don't know, over 7 years, I think. And I've said this numerous times, like, and I'll give some other examples where I think you can even give, which Nick kind of refused to do. I think you can even give some metaphysical content to the symbols that he wants to put on the screen and it still be consistent. Like I can even go further than what Nick actually did or wanted to do throughout the debate. But I think those different models are still problematic for one reason or another. Maybe I should just give an example, right? So typically the logical problem of the Trinity, which Nick also thought that it was going to be limited to that, but for me, whether or not the Trinity is logical isn't really strictly limited to just the logical problem of the Trinity, because you could have other arguments for why you think that the Trinity is logical or illogical, right? But anyway, just kind of limiting it to the LPT. Usually, I mean, it's has different forms, either 3 premises or 7 premises, but the 7 premise formulation of the argument is that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and yet there's only one God. Now, even the phrase, the logical problem of the Trinity, is kind of misleading because there isn't necessarily one logical problem associated with that. One of the common problems or ways that it's cashed out is that there seems to be a conflict between the first 6 premises, where you're saying that there are 3 distinct divine persons or 3 individuals who are each God. And then when you get to the seventh premise, you're saying that, well, there's only one God. And by the normal manner in which we count, which is by identity or Leibniz's law, it would seem from the first 6 premises that there are 3 gods, and yet the 7th premise says there's only one God. So now the Trinity seems like a contradiction. Well, there are 3 gods, and yet you're saying there's one God. So that's contradictory. That's one way of trying to cash out what the logical problem is supposed to be. And one very common solution, which Branson kind of does a taxonomy of different solutions to the problem, is what he calls the equivocation solution, which is that you equivocate on is God between premises 1 to 3, and then premise 7 on the other hand, right? So whatever it, and there are different ways that that's done, but there's no longer a contradiction, because you can say, well, there are 3 things that are God, or 3 things that are divine in some sense in the first 3 premises. But then whatever is God is supposed to mean in the final premise, where you say there's only one God, it has a different meaning, right? So you're equivocating on what the meaning of God is between the first 3 premises and the 7th premise. And as long as you do that, there's no direct, in this case, there's no direct contradiction anymore. You don't have 3 gods and one God in a contradictory way, because in order for that to work, there would have to be 3 gods and one God in the same sense. But if all you mean is there's one God in one sense of the word God, and you even are willing to admit, as some Trinitarians are, that there are 3 gods or 3 divine beings in another sense of the meaning of the word, well, then there's no formal inconsistency. There's no contradiction. All you're saying is there's one God in one sense and 3 gods or 3 divine persons or 3 divine beings in another sense.
I want to give an example of that, because maybe people are wondering what.
Yeah, I have 2 examples.
Okay, good. You're going to give an example. Good. Okay.
So there are, these are the most common ways. That doesn't mean it's totally exhaustive from a logical standpoint. You could dream up other possibilities, but 2 of the most common ways is that they'll say that premises 1 to 3, where it says is God, just really means is divine, right? So you're saying the Father's divine, the Son is divine, and the Holy Spirit is divine. And then when you get to the 7th premise, that there is only one God, or that there is exactly one God, is God there sometimes means the Trinity, right? So, and this is how William Lane Craig does it, and William Hasker as well, is that they'll say that there are 3 divine things, which refer to the persons in the first 3 premises, but there's one God in the sense of the Trinity. So the Trinity is an actual thing, which is also debated amongst Trinitarians. Is the Trinity actually a thing? Is it an entity? Or is it just shorthand to refer to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? But in this case, the Trinity actually is a thing, right? And then the way that Craig and Hasker, explain their model further is that they'll say each one of the persons is divine because they're parts of the Trinity, right? So now there's two ways to be divine. One way to be divine is to be the Trinity, and ultimately this is the one God. And then there's another way to be divine, which is to be part of this entity, right? And from that standpoint, even filling in with some metaphysical content behind the statements, there is no, at least from my point of view, and you guys are happy to disagree with me, there is no formal inconsistency or contradiction there. But the problem with that doctrine is, and this is the whole point why you have to go beyond merely just the formal consistency in a specific logical system, which Nick wanted to limit it to. The problem with that is most Trinitarians, and historically this has been the case, are going to be uncomfortable with saying that the persons of the Trinity are merely just proper parts of one God, because what they want to say is, no, each one is fully God in the most important sense, right? And so this is going to be a worry about a heresy, which is sometimes called partialism, in which case each person is merely part of God and not fully God, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? But if you don't have a problem with that, and if that's not really a theological concern for you, then go ahead. You can take that kind of model and run with it. There are other criticisms of that model, but I just want to get to the other way in which they'll make the equivocation between is God in premise 7 and then the first three premises. The other way that some people do it is based upon a doctrine or model they call monarchical Trinitarianism. Well, they say that the first three premises, again, are going to roughly stand for something similar, that each one of the persons is divine or is in God, in that they possess the divine nature or something like that. But the Father is God is going to refer to how there's only one God in the seventh premise. And what they mean by that is, given the doctrine of divine processions or the Nicene Creed, that only the Father is unbegotten and the Son and the Holy Spirit are begotten and spirated from the Father, that there's only one God in the sense that there's only one fundamental divine person. So only the Father alone is uncaused and fundamental, and the Son and the Holy Spirit are caused, or in sort of modern terminology, Joshua Sijuade and Branson sometimes are happy to use this type of metaphysical relation of grounding, that the Father is ungrounded and the Son and the Spirit are grounded by the Father. Now, in this case, again, there's no direct contradiction based upon this interpretation of the seven premises, because there are three divine things and there being three divine persons, and there's one divine thing or one ultimate God in the sense of the Father, and there's no contradiction because there's an equivocation on the terms. But my typical pushback to this model is, well, the problem with this is you still have a concern about, in the first three premises, it sounds like you're saying there are three gods in a sense, right? So there's one God in one sense of the Father, but there's also kind of three gods in a sense of each one of the divine persons. Now, Branson has his own, retort and response back to that about counting by identity versus counting by division and this whole thing. But the point is, in that case alone, there is no direct formal inconsistency or contradiction when you equivocate on the terms, is God in question in the first three premises versus the seventh premise. That doesn't mean that I don't think Craig's model or Branson and Sijuade's model are logical. I think that there's other problems and concerns with them, in that, especially with Branson and Sijuade, is that they're still going to have three gods in a sense. And Sijuade in the past has been willing to even say that and admit that and say, well, yeah, if by God you mean individual with the divine nature, well then, yeah, there's three of them. So there's three gods in a sense, right? But so now if you don't have a problem with that and you're willing to embrace that and accept that as part of your model, then good. I mean, you have quote unquote solved the LPT in that sense that there's no formal inconsistency there, but that's a tough pill to swallow for most Trinitarians. They're not going to want to say that the persons are merely proper parts of the one God. And they're also not going to want to say that there are three gods in some sense. They want to eliminate that there is polytheism in any sense of the term within the model. And in that case, neither position is or model is really going to work. But they're both still, formally consistent in responding to this. So anyway, I don't know. I'm sorry for talking a lot there, but I hope that gives some insight into how I'm thinking about this.
No, that's good. I'll say something really quick, and then you can go. Look, when I think about the logical problem of the Trinity, it's sort of based on a kind of straightforward interpretation of what the doctrines are saying. If they want to say something like, "Oh, when I say that the Son is God," well, that's not strictly speaking correct, or that's like a shorthand for saying something about him being a part of, or being a divine being in some other sense. Then okay, then they can say that, and they're committing to something that's not really captured or not what we're getting at when we bring up this logical problem. That's fine. There may be other problems with that, as you say, but not this one, because they're just not accepting one of the commitments that the logical problem is attributing to them.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to say that there's another, you brought up the counting problem, right? Branson has talked about a form of the LPT, the identification problem, where we're asking, okay, there's the term God, who does that, or what specifically does that pick out? Who does that pick out? Which, is a concern that's over and beyond the formal consistency of the doctrine, right? It's about how the semantics are being used. And yet, we have people saying that that's a form of the LPT. People say that's a form of the LPT. So I think that the way that Nick has framed or interpreted the word illogical is myopic and just completely missing the point of the anti-Trinitarians' anxieties about the creed, the Nicene Creed, and what Trinitarians did say. I think it felt like if you were anti-Trinitarian, right? It certainly felt like this was kind of a gotcha sort of gimmick thing going on, right? Where I think that, especially knowing your background, because he's debated you before, right? He knows the sorts of arguments you typically run, the counting problem being one of them, right? To just ignore that and say, well, this is actually the problem. This is that we're gonna respond to this argument, right? And when that's not the source of the anxiety, right? I think is a little sleazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing, I'm actually trying to remember what I was going to say now. Besides this whole logical consistency thing, because I made a couple notes. He said at one point during his opening, he said that the properties, like the symbols on the page, F, S, and HS, or however he wrote it, he said even the properties of what they possess is totally irrelevant. And he's trying to make this hard distinction between, logical and metaphysical. But as we're going into it, the metaphysics and the content behind, the model and the doctrine is, of course, relevant. Otherwise, we could come up with, I did it in a way, giving two examples that are models that people actually try to present, but we could do it in all sorts of silly ways, right? To make it consistent, and it's just trivially true. It doesn't really mean much of anything at all. Also, what I went through now was just one, as Danny mentioned, one rendition or way of explaining the logical problem of the Trinity. But another logical problem with the Trinity that those models that I just went through don't potentially even come across is the transitivity problem, or the problem with Leibniz's law, that if you say the Father is God and you understand that as an identity statement, that the Father is identical to God and then the Son is identical to God, but yet they're not each other, well, by the normal standard way in which we would cash that out is that if two things are identical to some third thing, then they would have to be identical to each other, right? Or another way would be that if the Father, or let's say the Son, and let's say that God in this instance is going to, which most of the time it does, for the people who say that the persons are identical to God, usually they understand that as the divine essence. So let's say that the Son is supposed to be identical to the divine essence. Well, if they're going to be identical, then they would have to share all of the same properties, right? Under how classical identity is typically understood. And in this case, the Son is begotten of the Father, but the divine essence isn't. So how could the divine essence and the Son be identical to each other if they don't share or possess all of the same properties? Now, these are different, quote unquote, logical problems, but notice these logical problems only come about based upon how the 7 premises are interpreted, right? So you have to actually tell us how the Trinitarian, like I don't have to force my position on them. They can interpret it any way they want, and then I'll deal with it or respond accordingly. But this problem that I just mentioned of somebody who interprets the Father is God and the Son is God as being identical to God, I can't even bring up this potential logical problem to somebody like Craig because he would agree with me, and that's why he doesn't interpret those premises or statements in that way, right? So, you know, I'm just shocked. I mean, I don't know if it's naivete on Nick's part or malice. I don't really know, but I'm just surprised that even several people in the audience, actually, I guess I'm not too surprised because we're dealing with a lot of lay people here, but a lot of people are just not aware of the complexities and details that we're going through now. They think it's just very simple and straightforward, but no, a lot of it does depend upon how the Trinitarian themselves even interprets those statements, what their metaphysical commitments are, you know, how they provide content to all of this. So, yeah, I just wanted to add that because Danny was bringing up the who is God problem, which is also a distinct. Then you also have, sorry, I think I cut out there for a second. Am I back?
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
Okay. So yeah, you have the who is God problem, and then you also have this other, you know, problem of identity. So there's not just one logical problem. There are many different problems associated with it, depending on how you interpret it. And also the other thing is that most Trinitarians are going to take seriously historical or sort of theological and traditional concerns about it's not just how you fit this on the paper. It's about, well, how has this doctrine traditionally been interpreted and received and by the scholars and church fathers and their tradition, and what does their own church say about this, and what councils are relevant. Like, for example, William Lane Craig, as like a very hardcore Protestant, he rejects the doctrine of divine processions in the Nicene Creed because he says it results in subordinationism, in which the Son would not possess the full divinity of the Father because only the Father. I think I cut out there again. Only the Father is ase or ungrounded, and the Son and the Holy Spirit are not. But most traditional Trinitarians are going to have a problem with that because they're going to want to adhere to what the early councils and creeds and church fathers actually said. So anyway, I don't know if you guys have anything else to add about this particular point.
Very quickly, you know, part of this is a little bit frustrating for us, or at least for me, that when someone asks me, okay, give me an argument against the Trinity, right? The problem is that there are so many different interpretations and modeling and even logics, right, that are being employed. This is my personal approach to when you're talking to a Trinitarian, is to say, hey, when I read the creeds, when I hear people talk about the doctrine, right, it seems like if I just standardly reason about these things, or standardly count the way I usually count it, you get 3 gods. Like, what am I missing, right? And then you could explicate that counting method, right, and give what the Muslim meme, as you put it, right? The thing is that that's the way I approach it. I approach it in terms of what I've read in these creeds, what I've heard typically. But truly speaking, there's so many different responses. Like, there's not like a one-all objection that covers everything, right? Because it's like, it's a little bit frustrating that way. And I wanted to explain why. It's sort of an awkward question when someone asks me what makes the Trinity illogical. Like, what am I missing as a Trinitarian, right? I'm like, well, are you interpreting the creed the way I am, right? It's kind of, because if you are, then it seems like there are 3 gods, and I don't know how you're getting 1.
Right. I guess before we move on to Nick's rebuttal, I'll just very briefly summarize what my opening is so we don't have to waste time. I basically presented 4 arguments, kind of the standard LPT, and went through like the counting problem, because I knew that Nick didn't hold to the strict identity between the divine essence and the person, so I didn't even go through that. So I just went basically through the counting problem version of the LPT. And then I went as an extension of that, because Nick affirmed something which is called the essence energies distinction. Now, I personally don't have a problem with that, because I believe in God, first of all, and I believe that God has multiple distinct divine attributes. So I don't make the common argument from composition, well, that mere multiplicity entails that there's composition, and if there's composition, there has to be causation, and therefore God, being uncaused, would have to have a cause outside of himself. Anyway, it's kind of a slippery slope, but this is the way that some people who propose like a very strict form of divine simplicity will make this argument. I don't make that argument, because I don't affirm divine simplicity in that way. But my concern about the essence energies distinction is that they will say that each one of the energies, which is really distinct from the persons and from the divine essence, each one of them is fully God. Now, I don't take that position. I don't believe that each attribute of God is fully God. I wouldn't say that, God's omniscience is fully God in that way. So that's why I don't think I fall into the same problem. But I think it's an extension of the LPT, because now you wind up with more than 3 entities, more than the divine persons. You wind up with an infinite amount of non-identical things, which each are God. So by the normal way in which we count, which is already part of the LPT, you just get, a bigger problem, so to speak, or more things that are not identical, which each are called God. So that was kind of my second argument. It's nothing really too crazy. I mean, it's just an extension of the LPT. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that particular point, or criticisms or anything.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, as I recall, though, he's going to want to say that, strictly speaking, the energies as they manifest in the world are not identical to God, but there's really only one of them in ontology, or maybe we'll get to this. There's only one.
Yeah, that was weird, but yeah. So, insofar as I'm representing the position correctly, which is whatever, can be up for debate, but insofar as I understand it, each one of the energies is distinct from the essence and the persons, and yet they're considered to be fully God. So then you would have more than 3, divine entities. Yeah. But anyway, it's not really that important, because if you're not convinced by the counting problem with the LPT, this one is not going to really bother you too much. It's just an extension of the same kind of worry, right? And then the whole other thing related to the energies, which is my 4th argument about these uncreated fires and birds. We don't have to really get into that, but my claim was that Nick was representing a heretical position, because he was saying that the temporal manifestations of God in creation, which they sometimes call the theophanies, or like God speaking from the burning bush, the fire, or in the Old Testament, he appears as a cloud. I know it sounds kind of strange, and that's why people think I'm even misrepresenting the position, but they believe that everything that's visibly seen in that case is uncreated. It is God in an uncreated manifestation, whatever that's supposed to mean. Whereas Nick was saying, no, the fire is actually created by God. And for people who are interested, because we're not going to hang up too much on this point, you could watch, I put together a clip from Nick's recent debate review with Jay Dyer, where Jay Dyer corrected him, said he was wrong, said that his position technically is heretical, but he wasn't declaring him heretic, because heresy is more to do with sort of an obstinate refusal to accept what the church says. So if you have an excuse of ignorance, you're not necessarily a heretic. But if you once sort of it's explained to you, and if you persist obstinately in this heresy, then you become a heretic. But anyway, I mean, that was kind of, to be honest, it was kind of, to me, it's so obvious. Like I just put it in this form. All birds are created. Since Nick believes in uncreated birds, therefore he's going to have some type of illogical or irrational position. And somebody like Jay Dyer is just going to say, well, no, I'm just going to deny that all birds or all fires are created. And again, it doesn't really go much further than that. It's just, that if you want to take what I think is an illogical and absurd view, that there are like uncreated fires and birds and stuff like that, then fine, you're going to have a self-consistent position. But I just think that most people aren't going to accept that view, right? But the more interesting argument that I used, that I haven't really popularly used before, which I'm very interested to get your guys' take on, is that I know Danny has definitely seen it. I don't know about you, Troy, if you've seen, there's this discussion between Muslims and Christians, or even inter-Christian disputes about whether or not Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And Danny has participated in a few of those discussions. Now, the common way that the Catholics usually deal with it, and it's because of a later Vatican II council, which they think that they're, required to believe that Muslims and Christians do worship the same God. And I think that is the correct interpretation of Catholic dogmatic teaching. They'll appeal to the Phrygian sense reference distinction and say that, you can have an entity in which, let's say Danny and I, like, we could have different descriptions even of Troy right now. Like, I can think he's a nice guy. I'm just making a silly example. And Danny could say, oh no, I don't really think he's a nice guy. He's kind of rude and things like that. But what Frege pointed out, and what most philosophers have taken kind of going forward, is that, merely having conflicting descriptions about the same entity doesn't necessitate that we're talking about different entities, right? Like, we could have different descriptions and still have the same referent in mind, or capturing the same referent. I think that's correct, even apart from this whole debate, just kind of in an overall general philosophical context. So I'm happy to even grant that Muslims and Christians could worship the same God. I don't have a problem with that. But I was pressing Nick for internal consistency, because he and many Eastern Orthodox usually are on this bent that no, Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God. And it's like, okay, well, what's the argument or the reason for that? Well, because God is a Trinity, and Muslims don't worship a Trinity, or we believe God has a son, an eternal divine son, who's part of the God or whatever, and Muslims don't believe in that, so therefore we don't worship the same God. Now, the issue with that is, first of all, that's just in the description level, like we're just describing God differently, but we could still have the same referent in mind. But even if we granted, right, that, okay, no, this is a real, genuine property difference between the Muslim understanding of God and the Christian understanding of God, I think for people like Nick, that causes a problem. Because what my argument basically was, if merely having different properties is sufficient for counting as distinct gods and not being the same God, then if you carry that over after the Muslim and Christian conception of God debate, and you say, well, Muslims and Christians can't worship the same God because Christians worship a Trinity and Muslims don't. So there's a property difference between them, and they're not identical, right? They're discernible in that way. Well, then if the Father and Son are each God, and yet they don't share all the same properties, they're discernible, they're not identical, well, then the fallout from that, if you're consistent, should be that they're not the same God, or they don't count as the same God. So I was kind of trying to form a dilemma for Nick of saying, if you hold that position, fine, about Muslims and Christians not worshiping the same God because they don't share the same properties or they're not identical, right? Then by that same reason, the Father and Son, you would have to say, are not the same God because they don't have all the same properties and they're not identical to each other. And yet they're, each God's still. So, or you can go the other route, and in virtue of my criticism, you could say, well, yes, because of that potential worry and carrying over to the Trinity, I'm going to have to say that merely possessing different attributes isn't sufficient for counting as more than one God. And you could still say that Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God, but you'd have to appeal to some other reason besides that, because that wouldn't be sufficient to make that claim. So what do you guys think about this kind of like consistency argument I was running based on that?
Yeah, I think that's good, right? If their argument for thinking that Christians and Muslims do not worship the same God is something like, well, look, if the Christian God exists, he has these properties. If the Muslim God exists, he has these properties, and they're different. And them having different properties, they can't be the same God, because the same God would have to have a single set of properties. Then they can't adopt this sort of view here where two things could be the same God in the Trinity, but have different properties, because then that would be inconsistent straightforwardly. So I think that's a fair point. And you're right to say that either they're going to have to give up on this claim about the Trinity, that two things can be the same God but have different properties, or, well, think that things could have different properties and be the same God, and so give up on at least that argument for thinking that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God. So that seems entirely correct to me.
Yeah.
Case in point, right? Jesus died on the cross, right? The Father didn't die on the cross via, the typical argumentation that they give for why the Muslims don't worship the same God as the Christians, right? Then that means that the Father is not the same God as the Son. So yeah, it does.
Or even the Father, right? The other thing, I didn't really press on this because Nick didn't really bite on much of what I had to say, but another thing they say is, well, and Islam, God is not a father. Well, if that's the case, then the Father and Son can't be the same God, because the Son is not a father, right? So in that way too, it works. I mean, there are many different ways you could kind of put it, but Nick, as far as I'm concerned, Danny, did you happen to watch the whole debate?
I did watch everything but the Q&A, so I might.
Okay, well, the Q&A is not so important. So I didn't really see him even attempt to respond to this argument at all.
I didn't see it.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe he didn't realize like kind of what I was getting at there. And I think it's okay, because I haven't really pressed and run this consistency argument very much. So it's kind of like a somewhat new and popular discourse, I guess. I'm not saying I uniquely came up with this, don't get me wrong, but it's just not as common. So maybe he didn't really get what I was trying to say or do with that argument.
Right. Well, Catholics are not going to have an issue with this, right? So
yeah, in fact, they might actually agree with it, right? They might actually say that, this is good reason to actually a Catholic could employ the same argument and say, look, we believe Father and Son are God, and they have different properties. One is a father and one is not. So therefore, it's not sufficient to say that since Allah, or the Muslim conception of God, is not a father, or whatever property difference you want to bring, is not sufficient to actually say that he's a different God. I think Catholics actually should use that argument.
Well, that the EOs and the Catholics wouldn't even be worshiping the same God, right? On
exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something actually, I don't think it was you in that discussion.
Mhm.
Because who did you have your debate with, Dan? Dan, you
It was, you mean my partner? It was Trent Doherty.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr.
and then
Trent
who
Doherty.
was it? And then who did you go against?
Cleve and it was a guy named Cleve, and then there was one other guy. Oh,
It wasn't Dyer. It wasn't Dyer.
It wasn't. No, I haven't. Really
Okay, so there was a debate on capturing Christianity between Dyer and Father Deacon Ananias, and then Trent and I think his name's Christopher Tomaszewski.
That's it.
Yeah, on the other side. And actually, what you just mentioned, and I was surprised. I was watching the debate all along. I'm thinking, why don't they press them on this? And the Catholics, eventually, it got down to not just like same God because they differ on the filioque. There was a discussion about the communion and the Eucharist and how that's to be understood of God's real presence in the bread and the wine or whatever. And then at one point, Christopher actually caught on and he's like, wait, so are you saying that Catholics and Eastern Orthodox can't worship the same God because they don't have the same concept of the Eucharist? And then he was like, yeah, I think I actually would have to say that. And I was like, finally, like you brought that up towards the end. But yeah, like if you really press it, even besides the Eucharist, like for Catholics, it's dogmatic to believe in the filioque, the idea that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and not merely the Father alone. Whereas Eastern Orthodox, it's dogmatic to reject that. No, the Spirit proceeds only from the Father alone. Well, that's a difference in the Trinity right there. So you would have to say, based upon accepting or rejecting the filioque, that you're worshiping a different God. So, but yeah, I wish Catholics would press more on these points to really, push them to their, the eventual logical conclusion of their position. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. By the way, it was JP Uncut. JP Uncut was the other guy in that debate.
My debate, yeah.
Then Danny's debate, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So anyway, that was those were my four arguments that I went through. The uncreated birds one, honestly, that was kind of more like just to say, like, come on, this is a silly kind of belief. And then the LPT and the energy one kind of went together. That was based on the counting problem. And then this argument was just kind of like an internal consistency worry. So that's it. I think we can kind of move now to Nick's, let's see, his response, his initial response to my
rebuttal.
Yeah, his first rebuttal to basically what I just explained my arguments were in the opening. Let's go to this.
This was also pretty short, if I recall.
Yeah, it was very short. All of his everything he didn't take up in terms of his opening statement, his rebuttal, and his closing statement. He didn't take up all the time. The only one he took up all the time on was the cross-examination. So,
Nick, do you have slides you want to put up? 5-minute rebuttal. I will start on your first word whenever you are ready.
Cool. So his whole argument was about what I predicted in my opening slides, which was metaphysics, which has nothing to do with the topic of logic. He talked about there being theophanies of uncreated birds. Whether or not it's even true that there's theophanies of uncreated birds has nothing to do with how we count God and if God is multiple or not, given the model that I give. He gave a appeal to J. Dyer fallacy, my great brother J. Dyer, quoting Jay talking about Pentecost. Again, nothing to do with the topic of whether or not it's illogical. All of these things, there could be uncreated birds, and it has nothing to do with the Trinity model that I gave. He's going to have to prove my Trinity model that I gave is actually wrong. He asked if distinction is sufficient for counting different gods. Again, that has to do with metaphysics. So what the distinction is and understanding what the distinction is between one or two gods has to do with the metaphysics of the thing. It has nothing to do with how we actually model it itself.
You guys catch what he said there? The distinction between one or two gods. Did you catch that? Let me just go back.
Gods. The model that I gave. He's going to have to prove my Trinity model that I gave is actually wrong. He asked if distinction is sufficient for counting different gods. again, that has to do with metaphysics. So what the distinction is and understanding what the distinction is between one or two gods has to do with the metaphysics of the thing. It has nothing to do with
Yeah, I think he meant something like
itself.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think he meant something like the distinction between, you know, the Muslim God or Christian God or one God or another God. I think that's what probably what he meant there, but I'm not so sure. Otherwise, yeah, it didn't make any sense.
Yeah. Because I mean, he didn't really give that context. So I was thinking maybe he's talking about between the Father and the Son, but maybe that's not a charitable way.
Yeah, it's not clear. It's not clear what
I thought he was just saying something like, look, whether, you know, on some view there would be one God or two gods or more, like, you know, it depends on these other facts about counting and so on.
Okay, yeah,
but I think it was, but whatever.
Yeah. I'm just kind of nitpicking, I guess, but yeah.
He said there needs to be a non-ad hoc counting method. So again, while I believe that the way that I'm counting is not ad hoc, even if it was ad hoc, logic doesn't care whether or not your counting method is ad hoc. All that logic cares about is whether or not that it's consistent. So even if it's an ad hoc counting method, as long as it is consistent, there is no issue. It is logical according to what the SCP defines as this. He brought up the church father. Church fathers, again, what the church fathers believe and don't believe has nothing to do with my specific model. He's going to have to deal with my model in the cross-examination. He also brought up the human nature argument of, oh, well, why is there multiple different humans? Well, the difference is going to be our metaphysical commitments into what we believe about these things. And so the reason we count different humans is because of the fact that we're presupposing the metaphysics of what we believe about humans. In this model, in this set that I'm giving, we're presupposing no metaphysics here. I'm simply showing you the set, I'm showing you the model, and you're gonna have to show me how the model itself is illogical and it doesn't work. So what Jake is going to have to do in the cross exam is, instead of showing me that the metaphysics doesn't make sense, even if all my metaphysics could make no sense, right? The divine energies could make no sense. The theophanies could make no sense. That's an entirely different debate. What he's going to have to show me is that the logic of my model itself does not make sense. And I can't wait to do that.
Okay, so that was the end of his rebuttal there. Any quick thoughts?
I mean, we've sort of already covered this already, but like, again, it seems to me like if all he wants to say is that it's like syntactically possible to use the relevant terms like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and so on, and God, in a way that's like that can be consistently modeled in some formal system. That okay, that's true, right? I grant that can be consistently modeled that way in that formal system, but that's not to say that. And if that's all he means by logical, then okay, it's logical in that sense, but it's not logical in other senses that I think people are normally concerned about. And in particular, it doesn't tell us whether the relevant terms, like the way the relevant terms are actually used, especially as it relates to like what people actually believe and authoritative texts and creeds and so on, that they could be appropriately modeled in that way. And it also doesn't tell us whether like other things like identity and so on can be appropriately modeled in that way. Those seem to me further questions that do relate to whether we think something is logical or illogical in a more usual sense that I think we'd be concerned with here. Like bring you back to the example I gave earlier. Like I could say the three of us are all the same person, but distinct beings in some sense. And is that logical? Well, in this narrow sense where like you could use those terms in a way on some and regiment them in some system that would be consistent. Sure. But obviously it's illogical in some more natural sense that we're often concerned with. And I want to say something similar here about the Trinity. At least it appears to be illogical in some more normal sense, and then you can present the logical problem of the Trinity and explore that. I just pointing out that there's some way to use those symbols that's consistent in some formal system is like really getting us nothing. So we kind of covered this already, but that's what I would say about that.
Wait, I do have a question for you two. It seems like on this control of what the LPT is, right, then historically speaking, very few, if not if any, right, church fathers actually addressed the LPT as construed by Nick, right? Like it's maybe I could be corrected on that. Like if the kind of inconsistency is kind of syntactic, that we're looking at a kind of predicate logic or something like that, that the church fathers didn't have those tools. Now, that doesn't mean that they require them in order to form well-formed sentences, but at least it casts suspicion about whether what Nick is talking about and the problems that Nick is addressing and the problems of what his church fathers are addressing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And also it relates to something where I think he's kind of contradicting himself. In my opening statement, I mentioned Gregory of Nissa and his initial attempt at responding to the counting problem, because the way he set it up, which I read it directly from his letter to one of the bishops at the time, was like you have a dilemma in the way that he's understanding the problem. Either the Trinity is true and there's three gods, or the Son and the Holy Spirit can't be God. That's the way Gregory of Nissa sets up the dilemma. It's like, okay, yeah, he's basically onto the same, like, intuitive counting concern about there being three gods in the Trinity that we are today. And his response, which I think is laughable, but I mean, if you want to take it, you can, is that, well, instead of, because he was worried about the consistency. Well, he brought it up, like, this is not Jake. He says Peter, James, and John sharing the same human nature. Well, if we call them as three men by our normal parlance and how we speak, then why can't we call the Father, Son, Holy Spirit three gods? And his response is like, well, it's because we're wrong in our normal way in which we speak. We should actually say that Peter, James, and John are one man, and that's somehow going to preserve the consistency of saying that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are actually one God. And again, if all you mean, I don't hold to this view. For example, I'm a nominalist, so I don't hold to like these universals in that way. But even if I granted it, right, for the sake of argument, if all you're saying is that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one God in the same way that Peter, James, and John are one man, by that they share this universal essence, it's like, okay, but they're also three gods or three men in another interesting sense, in the normal way in which we would call them three men or three human beings, right? So that's the issue, is that, like, in this case, Gregory of Nissa perfectly had a chance to respond. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about in a way that he's going to come forward with relative identity logic, which was developed much later on. I'm not saying that, but even in terms of the content of his response, it shows he had none of that in mind. Like he was not thinking of anything that Nick is thinking of at all. And also in Nick's response, did you notice that I brought up that example? I'm like, okay, well, if, Peter, James, and John are three men, even though they share the same essence, then that shows that possessing the same universal nature essence isn't sufficient to count as one in the kind of things that is being discussed. And so therefore you would have to appeal to something else besides merely sharing the same universal essence within the Trinity to explain how they should count as only one God, right? And his response to that, because I wrote it down when he was just talking now, he said, this is about our metaphysical commitments. That's explicitly what he said. He said, this is about our metaphysical commitments and what we believe in terms of the metaphysics of human beings versus God. And I'm like, yeah, okay, now we're getting somewhere. That's why we have to go into the metaphysical commitments. You can't just say, well, it's a difference in metaphysical commitments and what I believe about humans versus God. Okay, but what is the relevant distinction supposed to be? And how does that, relate to the counting problem and so on and so forth? So it's like, on the one hand, he's kind of recognizing that you have to go into the metaphysics to explain the difference between the one or three human being versus one God, three God problem. But then on the other hand, he doesn't really want to go into those metaphysical beliefs. So I don't know. It just seemed like an inconsistency there.
Yeah, like if someone said, like, look, here's my resolution to the logical problem of the Trinity, and it ends up committing him to saying things like, there's only one man, like we're all the same man, or something like that. Then, and you want to say, but look, in this expression of the symbols and this formal system, it's consistent, so there's no logical problem. I would just look at you like you're crazy. It's like, okay, we're not concerned with that, right? Maybe in that system, those symbols don't contradict each other, but all the same, look at the consequence of your view. This is wholly illogical in some more normal sense. And that's what I think it's fair to point out. You're just wrong to have that commitment that we're all the same man.
Right. Danny, any kind of thoughts further on his...
other than the point that I feel like by framing everything this way, then I think most of the church fathers, not at all, and the people that have tried to address defending the doctrine, they're just talking about something different. Just not anything about whether the Trinity is logical or not. Just they're talking about some other stuff. That the logical problem of the Trinity is this new sort of phenomenon that in our theological discourse today, or in the last century or so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one more quick thing. Like, at one point, he shows a formula on his screen. You know, the conjunction of different things that on the system. Do you think that if he showed that and sort of explained the formal systems to these people in history who have been wrestling with this problem and said, look, this is consistent in the system, do you think that would be satisfying to them? Like that he'd resolve the issues they'd actually been concerned with? Of course not, right? It just seems trivially the case that they're concerned with something more serious, and that isn't resolved by just like, here's a formal system where those symbols can be combined in a way that's formally consistent. It just seems right. Obviously the case.
You guys mind if I jump forward to the cross-examination? I don't think we need to listen to my rebuttal because it's just
although you made was it in the cross-exam, you made a very good point about the JC Beale point. Did you make that point in in your rebuttal or in the cross-exam, right? Where, hey, look, if we take
I can't. I think probably both. If I did,
because I think that was a good point.
At least it's going to be in the cross-examination section. If it's not, then we can always go back.
Okay.
But anyway, let's listen to his cross-exam. He cross-examined me first. I just got to find where he does this. Let's see.
Well, it's not. It's okay. It's totally according to your paradigm. I'm asking according to the definition that classical logicians use, which is that
there is not one. Yes, it can be. Here goes into
is one God, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here.
What it is.
My bad. I'm not here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. Yep. There you go. Good.
Okay. Jake, what is an identity operator in first order logic?
Okay, so this is the beginning of his cross-examination section, which I don't think he's opening up with a very interesting question. But here we go. What does that have to do with my argument?
Why is he trying to quiz you about logic?
Because I'm giving you a formalization. And formalization uses an identity operator. So I'm asking, do you know what it is?
I have no idea what it is.
Okay, an identity operator in first order logic is basically the symbol that deduces that one thing is equal to another. Okay, are you familiar with that?
Okay, one thing being equal to another, and yeah.
Okay. Do you think that identity operators in first order logic are limited to absolute identity?
I don't know what you mean by the question.
So when we use the equal symbol in first order logic, is it limited to absolute identity, or can we use other types of identity?
It depends on what system it is. It depends on who is using the equal sign. It can be interpreted differently.
So it can be used differently?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, great. So I want to show you a formalization here that I used. This formalization is going to...
Now, do you guys agree with that? Troy, do you agree with that? That the identity operator could be used differently, or that's incorrect?
Well, it depends on what you mean by could be used differently, because like in standard first order logic with identity, it is just going to be, as like standardly interpreted, it's just going to be absolute identity satisfying Leibniz, stuff like that. Yeah, and so that's true. Now you could say, well, okay, I'm going to modify it slightly to reinterpret it in this way so that it satisfies these features instead. Or you could say, I'm going to introduce a different identity predicate or operator and employ it in this other way that satisfies other constraints. But otherwise, it's just an extension of first order logic. But yeah, I mean, I think he said something either there or a little bit later that I wouldn't quite agree with. I mean, the standard first order logic with identity would assume a kind of absolute identity satisfying Leibniz's laws. But
That's what I understand as well.
But if he wants to say, look, I can extend it or modify it in this way, and here's this other formal system that admits of a sortal relativized identity predicate, then you can do that. That's fine. You can develop that formal system. That's not the norm, but right now he's just making this sort of formal point, or really throughout this debate has been making this sort of formal point that you can have some formal system in which you could express these statements that are formally consistent. Again,
and a quick
that's
point.
fine.
Yeah, and by the way, Branson's background is logic. Like I think he started with logic in his academic career, and he specifically says that first order logic with identity is understood in this classic sense that Troy was talking about.
Yeah.
And then when he wanted to formalize Trinitarian statements with relative identity, he called it something different. I think he called RIP. I think I forgot.
It's a different.
Yeah, he uses a different. He's like, okay, this is a different language that we're using, or a different system, I should say.
It's a different.
Yeah. So
That's pretty much what I said. I said, well, it depends. I mean, the normal way in which this is used in first order logic is by interpreting the identity as classical identity. But yeah, technically you could modify that, sure, but that's not the normal way. That's basically what I was trying to say. But
his statements would not be well formed in standard first order logic with identity, because you don't have this equals G predicate. That's just not expressible in that system. But you could modify it or extend it in that sort of way. Yeah, I think you're fair to point that out.
Yeah. All right. Let's see where he goes on further. I mean, most of this is him trying to quiz me on what this term means or what this is, and but whatever. Let's see if we get anything out of it.
Deduce why we believe that it is one God. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here.
All right, I'll get that up. Oh, okay, yeah. All right, I'm ready.
All right, it's on the screen.
Okay, there you go.
All right, so I put this into a formalization using first order logic, and I was curious if you could find a logical inconsistency with this.
Was this part of your original presentation?
No, when I said I was going to formulate it, this is what it's about. No,
Okay, so this was not.
no. This wasn't
I asked because I just wanted to know if I missed it when he presented originally, because I don't remember seeing it. Yeah. So if you're merely talking about
real quick, guys. Part of it appears to not be on the screen there, Nick. It looks like where the F equals, there's an underscore.
Sure.
I paused the time.
Sure.
We just fix that a little bit.
Yeah, it's okay. It's you can see right there. It's just a G. That's all it is.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let's continue your time. Go ahead.
Yeah. So seems to be the hang up, or what your approach is the entire time. If you think that, and I'm just grabbing a book here because it's relevant to what I'm going to say now. If you think that merely providing a logical structure on paper in which the Trinity can fit in and be consistent within that structure itself, then sure, I fully grant that.
So you fully grant that according to the structure that the Trinity is logically consistent?
I mean, I'll give you an example. Peter Van Inwagen in this text here goes into quite a bit of detail regarding relative identity, and he formulates the Trinity and his particular model and understanding in what he calls relative identity logic. So yes, if you're using a relative identity logical structure in a similar way that Peter Van Inwagen is, then it can be self-consistent, but that has nothing to do with my argument.
So you agree, though, the model I gave is indeed logic. So the Trinity, the model that I gave, is indeed logically consistent.
No.
Okay, so can you tell me an inconsistency with this right here that I just gave you?
I think the problem. So you notice, like
Yeah.
when he's asking, when he says, "This is what I mean by logical," and in that sense, is it logical? I freely admit it, right? Like I'm openly stating yes. But then if you just ask me simplicator, like, is this? So you're agreeing that this is logical? And I'm going to say no, because now I'm interpreting it in a broader sense, right? I'm interpreting it in the common way that we've been speaking about the whole time.
Right. It's like saying, do you like anchovies on your pizza?
I don't.
Okay, so if I say that, do you think that anchovies on pizza is good as indexed as the way I understand good is in terms of my Danny good, right? Do you think that pizza is good in that sense with anchovies? You would say yes. Well, if what that means is good to you, then yeah, I'm not going to disagree that it's good to you, right? And then I ask, okay, now fine, now let's reset. Do you think anchovies on your pizza is good? Well, no. In that, because they're the broader sense, usually in that context, you're talking about the way they use the term good, or the good is indexed to you, right? So that's how, that's kind of what it reminded me of, right? No, I'm not going to, logical in that kind of maybe myopic sense, fine, right? But I don't think it's logical. I wouldn't say it's logical, right? Because I don't use that narrow sense of logical, especially in the context of this debate. That's how the analogy I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Sorry, somebody in the chat asked what the underscores are. That's just to signify that the letters after them are sort of subscripts. So like the equal signs here. So for example, that statement F does not equal underscore PS. That's a way of saying F is not the same person as S, right? So the Father is not the same person as the Son. But he is the same. If you go right below that where it says F equals underscore GH, that's a way of saying the F is the same God as H. So the identity operator there is being relativized to sortals, right? So it's not being used as identical to simpliciter or in some absolute sense, but identical to with respect to sortal P or G. That's what's being used there. Also, somebody's asking if you would bring up Mike, but I don't know. Oh, my audio.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
It's you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't have a problem with that, Mike. If you are willing to hang out for a little bit, we'll bring you on like towards the end and have a discussion with you. I don't have any problem with that. I told Danny actually about that privately. I'm perfectly fine with that. I just want to kind of
I did tell Mike about that. I said that toward the end or something.
Yeah, I just want to kind of get through the rest of this cross-examination, and then we can move.
But metaphysics, Mike, not IP, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Metaphysics, Mike. Okay. Yeah. All right, let's go. That you're not understanding is merely because you can put the model into a specific logical structure that you hold to, and it can be consistent within that therefore it's logical in the general sense. No,
what is logical? What does it mean for something to be logically consistent according to the class?
Exactly. That's what the debate is and the hang up is. The point is that if you are using a logical structure or a logical system like Van Inwagen does in the book, right, where he uses relative identity logic, and this is what he describes it as, then yes, it can be consistent within its own paradigm. However, I do not ascribe to that paradigm. I do not believe in or agree with relative identity logic.
Okay, that's fine. I didn't ask whether or not you agree with relative identity logic, and I'm asking what is the standard definition that classical logicians use for what does logical consistency mean?
I believe you put it in your opening statement.
Yes, it is that there is at least one model that provides no contradictions and is consistent within itself. So this model that I just gave, is this logically consistent, or does it have a contradiction within it?
No, in terms of its own, I mean, I'm repeating the same thing. It's just I think what you don't realize, or maybe the audience may not, I do want to just butt in there for a second. So
I was cutting out.
I think I cut out there. Can you hear me now, guys?
It would be good.
Yeah. So I think I don't know if you guys caught it, but he then asked, how do logicians standardly define this, right? So yeah, if you're asking in a very specific remit, how would a group of logicians define logical consistency? Well, then of course they're thinking about it, at least in the way that he's trying to make it, in a very narrow sense. But that doesn't mean, like, if you asked a logician, in a simple way, he's just, a friend of yours, and you talk to him, hey, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is logical? He's not going to probably even thinking about it in that very narrow sense either, right? So it just depends on exactly what the context of the discussion is, and what is actually being asked, and what the person's looking for, right? So anyway, I mean, I just think it's strange that he keeps harping on this point, but I don't know. I don't know if it's going to bore people, but I think much of this cross-examination is pretty much the same thing. Let me continue, I guess. Not realize is that there is not one logical system, right? There are different logical systems. There are some logical systems which accept true contradictions, in which people like J.C. Beale, who is a logician and philosopher, would say that, and it's sometimes called dialethism, that there could be such things as true contradictions, and that's fully consistent within the logical system itself.
I agree.
What's that?
I agree that paraconsistent logic. I agree. I know all of these things. Okay. But I'm asking you, according to what
your own logical system, the answer has been the same the entire time.
Okay, so
in your own logical system, if you're using relative identity logic, then yes, it can be formalized in a consistent manner within its own paradigm.
Okay, so the question is, according to the definition that classical logicians use, which is that for something to be logically consistent, unless you can give a different definition that you can provide a source for, the one that the logicians use is that if we can provide at least one model that is consistent, has no contradictions, it can be considered logically consistent. So according to that definition, is the Trinity model that I gave logically consistent? Yes or no?
It all depends on how we're defining logic. That's the whole point.
I just told you how we define it.
So I think I've been straightforward, right? Like, I didn't dance around the issue. When he asked the first time, I said, if this is what you mean by logic, then yes. Caveat. So I don't know why he wants me to keep repeating the same answer. It's kind of weird. Like, I could understand if I was dodging a lot, but I think I already answered the question head on like a few times. So it's just weird.
Yeah, one minor nitpick of what you said.
Any logic. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So one minor nitpick on paraconsistent logics. A contradiction is still inconsistent. It's just that it's admitted by the system. But anyway, I guess maybe this is sort of being a dead horse here. But again, if he wants to say that on some logical system that this collection of symbols, the formulas expressed in this way is consistent on that system, that's true. That's granted. Now, it's a further question whether the statements, the logical expressions there, are an appropriate model of the standard Trinitarian commitments, and whether the other symbols, like these relativized identity predicates, are an appropriate model of identity. And when people bring up things like these logical problems as it relates to the Trinity, those are relevant questions. They're not just saying that there's some way to use those symbols in some formal system that's consistent on that system. That would be, we're just repeating the same point, but yeah.
Logical system whatsoever.
We're talking about class. That's why I said, according to class, we're talking about classical logic right now. So according to classical logic, I gave you the definition of logical consistency. So can you answer the question now? Is this model?
I am answering the question. I am answering the question. I'm saying.
So just according to that, I'm not asking about different models. So just yes or no.
It's relevant. It's relevant.
Trinity logically consistent according to this model.
It's consistent in the same way that J.C. Beale's contradictory Christ is consistent.
Oh, okay. I'm asking, is it consistent according to the classical definition of logically consistent?
Only in the sense in which you use the term logic in such a general way to include all of these different formulations of logic, which I don't accept.
We're only using one. We're using first order logic.
Yes, and you're using relative identity logic, aren't you?
There's no such thing as relative identity logic. Relative identity is just a type of identity operator within first order logic. So again,
yes, you are relativizing identity, correct?
We're using the relative identity operator. It's not its own type of logic.
Identity is being relativized. I don't accept relative identity. That's the point.
Great. Whether or not you accept the relative identity, I'm not asking whether you accept it. I'm asking if there is a contradiction according to this view, or if we use the Trinity in this formulation, would that be logical?
And I already responded. When you say, would that be logical? According to Jake's logical paradigm and according to the logical paradigm that is the standard amongst logicians and philosophers, the answer would be no.
I'm not asking according to your paradigm. I'm asking according to the paradigm of classical logicians when they define logical consistency. Is this model I gave logically consistent according to that definition?
Oh man, I think you're missing the point. When you keep using the word logical and logic according to classical logicians, I'm saying to you that my interpretation of that is not an all-encompassing buffet of whatever you want to input. I don't accept relative identity or relativizing identity as a genuine aspect.
Brother, please, I'm not asking if you accept it. I'm not asking that. I'm not asking if you use it in your world. It's not what I'm asking, okay? What I'm asking is, and if you want to deny the definition that I gave a source for as well, for the
I'm just defining it differently.
So I'm not asking about your logic, what you take from, etc. I'm asking, using the relative identity operator and the formulation I gave, according to the definition that classical logicians use, is it logically consistent?
No.
Please, yes or no?
No.
Okay, so great. So then according to my definition, you said you agreed with it, that there must be a contradiction within this. So if you could put it back up on the screen, and I would like Jake to show the inconsistency here.
Again, I don't know if I'm talking beyond you or you're not understanding me. When you keep asking if it's logically consistent, it means according to what logical system?
I just told you first order logic.
According to what logical system?
First order logic.
If you're asking me, is it consistent in a logical system which accepts identity being relative? Is yes. If it's in a system that does not accept identity being relativized or take that as a genuine standard, then the answer is no.
Okay, does classical logic accept relative identity as a part of a specific model that can be used?
That's debated. Branson, for example, himself seems to think that it doesn't.
Okay, so do you believe it does?
No.
Or are you just saying you don't know?
No.
Okay, why do you believe that?
As I said, because I'm appealing to others who are experts in the field who are saying that no, how you define classical logic or classical identity is going to be understood in a specific way that does not have identity being relativized.
Wait, do you even know how to read this? Can you put it back on the screen? Do you know how to read this? Like, do you know what I'm saying here?
Dude, are you out of your mind? You're
just
not
asking you. If not, it's okay. It's totally fine.
You're not listening to what I'm saying at all.
Okay, I understand. I'm asking you a question. Do you know how to read this?
No, I do not.
So, all right, bro, you could have just said that from the jump, bro. Okay.
None of this has anything to do. None of this has anything to do with what I'm saying.
But it doesn't, bro. It does.
I'm not so sure why it would be relevant for whether you're able to read the symbols or not, if you already accept that there is a sort of system like the one that Van Wagen developed, right? That is self-consistent, right? That you're willing to say is logical in that way, right? According to the parameters of that system, right? You don't need to be able to. That's all you need to know as far as whatever what this formalization is, right? Like presume you like in your rebuttal, or I forgot maybe before, you just said that this could be something that Van Inwagen, right, gave or something.
Yeah, which
like
I'm going to give a quote from him just in a second, but go ahead.
So he just wants to quiz you and score rhetorical points. Obviously, it's not really relevant that you can interpret this completely. Yeah.
And the funny thing is that he doesn't really know much of what he's talking about either, because just a couple minutes earlier, he said this. Let me see if I can back it up. Let's find it quickly.
Oh, so
We're
that's
using
not
the
a great way to
relative
write it
identity
either.
operator.
But anyway,
It's what? Sorry?
it's also not a great way to write it either. But
wait, in
there's
terms
no
of the
brackets.
entire, it's all one big conjunction. Is that why? Is that or
Yeah,
what
all
is
being
it?
one big conjunction. Really, it'd be easier to have it in I think it would be 9 separate statements. It should, instead of underscores, it should be a subscript, because you can't really do that in Notepad. Anyway, it's just not a great way to write it.
Yeah.
It's not its own type of logic.
Identity is being relativized.
Its own type of
Identity, correct? You're using
just a type of identity. There's no such thing.
yes, and you're using relative identity logic, aren't you?
There's no such thing as relative identity logic. Relative identity is just a type of identity operator within first order logic.
Okay, so he said there's no such thing as relative identity logic. So this is from Peter Van Inwagen. It's from the text that I was holding up. I don't know where it is now. I would have to go look for it, and I would waste time. But if people are interested, it's you can just check the quote very easily. He says, a philosopher who denies the existence of classical absolute identity may find materials in the procedure I have outlined for an explanation of the fact that most philosophers and logicians have assumed that there is such a relation as classical identity. And then he says, as far as I am able to tell, relative identity logic has no utility outside of Christian theology. Now, you can disagree with him about these statements if you want. That's not the point. My point is just saying that Peter Van Inwagen, who developed this system in relation to the Trinity, in that article, he calls it relative identity logic. So I am using it in a way that is acceptable. And Nick just, I don't know, maybe he doesn't know this. Like if I wanted to score rhetorical points, I knew this quote at the time. Like I made this like 8 years ago. I could have responded and been like, hey, you're an idiot. You don't know. There actually is a way to actually call this relative identity logic. Here's Peter Van Inwagen, who develops this in relation to the Trinity. Here's what he said. Hey, you're a dummy. You don't know what you're talking about. But that wouldn't really be that interesting, would it? I mean,
yeah. I guess one of the reasons why it might even be appropriate for Van Inwagen to call relative identity, to use the phrase relative identity logic, is because that operator, the relative identity, the identity R, right, it denies, I think, symmetry and transitivity, right? Is that correct? Yeah. That at least transitivity. Yeah. So there's a way that there's certain inferences that are not.
It doesn't validate it cross relative, cross sortal, so to speak. Now you can have different logics, I guess. But when I think about a relative identity logic, I'm just thinking about any logic that can appropriately express claims about with identity relativized in this way. In particular, logic that will have a relativized identity operator in it. And if he's granting that, look, okay, here's a logic. He just calls it classical first order logic, but really it's an extension or modification of it that has a relativized identity operator. Then okay, that's and what you're saying is a relative identity logic. I don't think. I mean, it's just maybe semantics at that point that he didn't.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
That relative identity logic.
Yeah, and that's why at the beginning when he asked me, well, like, is this consistent with classical logic, or like he was asking it in different ways, and I said, well, it depends on how you define that. Like some people, like I think Branson sort of views it the way that it is kind of a different logical system in that way. Other people say no, it's really classical logic, but just modified with an extension in this way. But does it really matter? I don't think it really matters how we define it in that way. And none of this is really all that interesting and related to the debate and how I see it anyway. But
and one more quick thing. I think he slides between asking you, look, is this expression consistent on the system?
Yeah.
And that therefore, so the Trinity is consistent. That doesn't follow immediately, because I would want a couple more things. One, that the expressions or sub-expressions in this statement are actually an appropriate model of the Trinitarian commitments. And as well that this identity operator, this relativized identity operator, is an appropriate model of identity. Because if neither of those are true, then it doesn't follow that the Trinity itself is consistent. In fact, all that would follow is that this expression on this logic is consistent on that logic. But that could be granted.
Right. That's true. Seems to think that it doesn't.
Okay, so do you believe it does? The reason why I asked you that question,
there's no content
domain. We can use it's a specific domain that is being what we're talking. No, that's not
out of premises. No, I do not.
So all right, bro, you could have just said that from the jump, bro. Okay.
None of this has anything to do. None of this has anything to do with what I'm saying.
But it doesn't, bro. It does, because I told you that. Okay, what is a model in classical logic? What is a model?
Model is a set of premises that are being used to describe a particular doctrine.
What?
Yeah.
No. That's no. That's not okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, that's not what it is. Okay, what we're talking about when we understand what it is, it's a specific domain that is being used. Okay, it's a specific domain. We can use a identity operator. It's using different logical symbols, etc. This is what I'm giving you. The reason why I asked you that question.
There's no content.
No, the content is the things like the identity operator and the predicates.
What is the content? What is the meaning behind them?
The predicates. Okay, first order logic doesn't deal with content behind the predicates. Okay, that's basically no. Behind the predicates, you do the predicates themselves. Okay, so again, the reason why I ask you what a model is because according to my definition of logically consistent is, and again, the one I gave, SEP, is that there is one model, which is what I gave you just now, that there is one model in which you can give that is logically consistent. So again, I want to make this very clear and ask one more time. I don't care about any other model. I'm asking according to first order logic and classical logic, I'm asking specifically, would this Trinity model be logical?
No.
Okay, so then again, according to definition, that said that there has to be some sort of contradiction within the model itself that it would prove that it is illogical. So can you give me the
It doesn't have to be a contradiction within the model itself. What it is it's contradicting the standard logical framework that's used. You're appealing to SEP, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If you look at their entry on identity, it defines classical identity as obeying Leibniz's law, which you are not obeying.
Wait. You think relative identity goes against Leibniz's law?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so you think the identity operator in Leibniz's law is necessarily absolute identity?
Leibniz's law, yes, it is absolute identity.
Oh, can you not say that A is equal to B in one sense, and then that proves that they're identical in that sense entirely?
Okay, do you want me to actually bring you up the source from Stanford Encyclopedia to show you what it actually says?
That says that.
Wait, could you pause it here, Jake?
Operator is necessarily absolute identity.
It tells you that.
Could you pause it? What just happened there? Like, he asked what sounded like a very confused question. What did he ask?
First he asked if relative identity violates Leibniz's law, and he asked that in as if he was surprised that you would imply that. Like, what? Of course it does. It violates the indiscernibility of identicals.
It's literally the form of an interpretation of identity that's an alternate understanding of identity to the absolute one, right? Like, I don't understand. It sounded like he's confused there.
Yeah, very confused. It tells you that classical identity is understood as obeying Leibniz's law. And
I agree. This is
classical identity is part of the classical logical framework. So if you're not obeying Leibniz's law in terms of absolute identity, then you are not obeying a part of the classical logical structure.
Okay, can you show me a source that necessitates that Leibniz law uses absolute identity as the identity operator?
I can show you here.
I don't know how you could show me that when you didn't even know what an identity operator was 10 minutes ago. I don't know how you're going to show that.
Dude, if you want me to show it to you,
1 minute.
in my own time, so I don't waste your time, but I can show you exactly where the Stanford Encyclopedia entry explicitly states what classical identity is, how it's defined, and what domain it falls under, and yours does not follow that.
Okay,
so
okay, I'll just ask one more question.
It's not part of classical identity.
It's okay. I'll just ask one more question. Okay. What is the formalization of statements such the inference rule determines 3 gods? Do you actually have a formalization of your statements?
Yeah, I gave it in my opening statement here. If I pull it up here, second.
Okay, so we can wait for him to do it, and I'll just ask him one question about that. I assume this will be the last question. So once he pulls that up, I'll ask him one question about it, and then we can move on.
So Branson says, today we count F's by 1 logical subjects that are 2 discernible from, or at least not identical to one another, and are F, that is, if X and Y differ in any way and are both F-ish, we count them as 2 F's. So if you plug the Father and Son, for as an example, just as 2, for simplicity's sake, the Father and Son are logical subjects that are discernible from each other.
Yeah, I'll ask him one more question since he pulled that up.
Not identical to each other, are both F, meaning are both God, and they differ, are both F-ish, so we count them as 2 F's. We count them as 2 gods.
You're at time.
So yeah, I'll ask him one more since he just pulled that up. I'm just asking this. What is
he doesn't have to answer though.
Okay, I was going to ask you what's the inference rule for that.
Yeah, it's his time now.
I don't think he knows.
Okay, so all right, so now we're going to throw it over to Jake for his 15-minute cross-examination. I will start.
Any final comments before I go to mine?
Yeah.
That was so bizarre, right? I mean, I'll be quick. I mean, it seemed like the motivation behind those questions, which was an attempt to show that you don't know formal logic, or you don't know about, I disconnected there. You don't know about, philosophical logic, right? And then it ironically backfired, right? It sounded like he was confused about the exclusivity between the 2 types of identity, right? That one, their absolute identity is not relativized, and vice versa. And there were other sort of confusions about logic there, and it's ironic that the attempt was to show that you were ignorant about such things. But go ahead, Troy.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things there that could be commented on in that segment. But at the end there, look, if you want to give a formalization of the argument, I mean, Branson gives it at private points in his work. I'm sure Nick should be familiar with it. But if you can, I mean, you can make it even kind of simpler, right? You can say you can have one premise that just says the Father is God, like could be like GF, and then another premise that says the Son is God, so like GS, and then you have another premise that says the Father is not the Son, they're not identical in the standard sense, and then you would just have, and you can show that this contradicts standard monotheism expressed as saying something like, well, if this thing is God and this other thing is God and they're not the same thing, then there's different gods, right? Or the statement of monotheism would be something like, if this thing is God and this other thing is God, then they are the same thing, right? Because they have to be the same God. And you can show that those 4 statements are is it 4 that I did? Yeah, if those 4 statements are formally inconsistent in standard, like first order logic with identity. And that's kind of a straightforward inference. If he's asking you to write it out or show the inference rule from one step to the other, it just seems like it's just another attempt to quiz you on logic to score rhetorical points, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to my cross here.
Start the timer on your first word, Jake, whenever you're ready.
Okay, 1 second. I'm just removing this.
Gotcha.
Again. Okay, Nick, by what relation do you count gods in the Trinity?
Are you asking how we formulate it such that it's one God, or are you asking how we determine it, like in our epistemology?
No, I'm asking you, how do you count gods in the Trinity?
Sure. If you're asking how we formulate it, it's going to be using the relative identity operator.
Okay, so what makes it such that there's only one God in the Trinity?
Yeah, given that in our set of statements, there's only going to be one sortal.
One sortal, and what is that one sortal?
The sortal is going to be.
I saw you shake your head.
That's
like,
nonsense.
How does that make any sense?
There's one sortal counting, humans, but that doesn't mean there's one human in this room. Like, you need something more than that.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I guess I didn't really fully react to it because I was trying to. I don't know. I should have actually reacted to that. That was my fault. I should have actually stopped on that point.
One sortal.
One sortal, and what is that one sortal?
The sortal is going to be stand for God.
Okay, and what are the criteria to fulfill that sortal?
Yeah, a sortal itself doesn't have any underlying criteria more than just what it is itself, right? A sortal is just going to be a standard counting. It's going to be in place of a counting method. So it's going to be formalizing a certain statement. It doesn't say what the thing is itself.
How do you know what it is?
Yeah, we don't. We don't say what it is. We simply say it's God. It's standing in place for what we formalize. So when we say we know it's God, we don't know exactly what the attributes of this God is.
So when you say God, there's no content behind it?
Yeah,
Pause
the
it, Jake, for a
concept
second.
behind it is going to have
Just one thing. So is he saying that a sortal is just like the symbols? Like, I don't understand. Is it just like this empty syntax and that's all it is?
Yeah, that's why I'm asking, like, what's the content behind it? And he's just like, there is none.
Right, but that's contradictory because what a sortal provides is the criteria for counting. Otherwise, it's not the.
So why would you call it a sortal?
Right.
Yeah.
If there's no content there, it can't be a sortal because you need principles of individuation, of principles of whether you have 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Right.
So it's just extremely confused.
Yeah, I think
otherwise it's just something different or just some empty symbols. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he just doesn't want to go into that. I mean, very clearly, we saw his strategy the whole time is not wanting to go into the content or metaphysics or any kind of details whatsoever. And I think it's because when he does, I'm going to press him for consistency and he's going to fall apart at that point. He's not going to be able to be consistent. So anyway, let's continue. So when you say God, there's no content behind it?
Yeah, the content behind it is going to have to do with epistemology. So we have content behind it, but it's going to have to do with the epistemology of the thing, the metaphysics, not of the logic.
What is the content?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the question, but it has nothing to do with the logic.
What did he mean by has to do with the epistemology? Did anybody get that?
No. The content has to do with the meaning. Like what the terms even mean. Like maybe is he wondering, it's not like, is he asking like, does he think that you're asking him like how he knows what the meaning is or how he knows what God is? I'm not really, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I do get to that later on because, and I have a reason for that, but yeah, that's not what I was asking at this point anyway. But yeah, it was just weird.
The Trinity, the
It does
concept
have to
behind
do
it
with
is
it
going to be,
because what
yeah,
you
the
don't
concept
understand
behind it is obviously.
Oh,
gonna
I
be
was
what we're
muted.
doing
I was
with
muted for a second,
Christianity.
Jake.
Okay, and who defines that? Oh, sorry.
Did I misunderstand earlier? Did we hear that there's no content to there's just like a symbol? Did we just hear that? And then did he not just say that? Well, yeah, there is content. I could answer this question, right? I mean, it sounded like those were conflicting statements, but maybe I misheard him.
No, that's what he said. Like in the beginning, he said there is no content behind the sortal. Like,
and now he's saying there is, and he said he could answer that question. So it sounds like he's giving a contradictory answer. But I might have to.
Yeah, let me just go back a minute or so. Go ahead, Troy.
We probably won't review this part, but at some point in the audience questions, someone asked him if red is a sortal. The answer should be no, it's not a sortal. But he says it's a dummy sortal. Completely wrong. I don't know. I think he's just confused about what sortals are.
Those, yeah, and the pages that he cited there, Griffin said red entity, not redness. Or
red thing, right? Like
red
a red
thing.
thing.
Right,
But redness itself is not a sortal.
Right.
Right.
Red things, yeah, there's a class of red things, and you can talk about how they're individuated with respect to that.
Yeah, because red is an adjective, but a sortal has to be a noun, right? So
Right.
Right. There has
You
to
could
be
have a
things
red
that could
thing.
fall under that sortal. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But red itself
Right.
is not a sortal. Yeah. So
But notably, red thing is a sortal, but not a dummy sortal. Dummy sortals are sort of like these less informative ones, like thing or entity or object, not something like red thing or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going back a couple minutes here, or a minute or so, just to make sure that Danny and I are understanding them correctly. Are both God, and they differ. Are both F-ish, so we count them.
I was asking this.
Yeah, it's his time now. Over whenever you're ready.
Okay, we'll do it again. By what
How are you asking how we determine it, like in our epistemology?
No, I'm asking you, how do you count gods in the Trinity?
Sure. If you're asking how we formulate it, it's going to be using the relative identity operator.
Okay, so what makes it such that there's only one God in the Trinity?
Yeah, given that in our set of statements, there's only going to be one sortal.
One sortal, and what is that one sortal?
The sortal is going to be stand for God.
You could have one sortal
Okay,
and there'd be
and
many
what are
gods.
the
It doesn't tell
criteria
you
to
that there's only
fulfill
one of
that
them.
sortal?
Yeah, a sortal itself doesn't have any underlying criteria more than just what it is itself, right? A sortal is just going to be a standard counting. It's going to be in place of a counting method. So it's going to be formalizing a certain statement. Doesn't
Okay, so he did
what
say-
the thing is itself.
Okay, look. How do
Okay,
you
so he
So
did
it's
say
being
he did say
formalized
there's
in a certain
content.
statement.
It's just not the. He did say there's. What did he say that there's no content, but it does tell you what it is. Like
even this statement here is kind of contradicting. Just let's parse it out here.
Underlying
Criteria to fulfill that sortal.
Yeah, a sortal itself doesn't have any underlying criteria more than just what it is itself, right?
What does that mean?
Then what it is itself. What is what it is itself getting at?
Yeah, right. Because in the beginning it seems like he's saying it doesn't have any criteria other than what it is itself. Well, what does that mean? I mean,
but then he goes on
there,
to suggest that there's some something about counting, right? Right after this, what does he say again?
Yeah. Let's listen.
Sortal is just going to be a standard counting. It's going to be in place of a
sortal is just going to be a standard of counting in place of counting.
Well, so the most, I guess, the most charitable interpretation of that is something like the sortal is going to tell you how to count things that fall under that sortal, or something like that. In which case, yeah, that should be right. But you're asking to
what is that?
Explain how that works in the case of the sortal God, right?
Right, exactly. Which he's refusing to answer.
So then he should be able to do that, right? Otherwise, he's just, it's not clear what sortal he's using or that he's even employing a sortal.
Right.
Itself doesn't have any.
What are the criteria to fulfill that sortal?
Yeah, a sortal itself doesn't have any underlying criteria more than just what it is itself, right? A sortal is just going to be a standard counting. It's going to be in place of a counting method. So it's going to be formalizing a certain statement. It doesn't say what the thing is itself.
How do you know? It doesn't say what the thing it is itself. It's going to be a standard for counting. I don't know. It's a bit weird.
It's like every time I hear it, like I couldn't represent him correctly in my what did he just say? What did he say? Well, I have to constantly ask myself this question, right? What did he just say?
Yeah. Let's see if he gets any clearer. Know what it is.
Yeah, we don't say what it is. We simply say it's God. It's standing in place for what we formalize. So when we know it's God, we don't know exactly what the attributes of this God is.
Did you hear what he said? We when we say it's God, we don't know what the attributes of the God are.
So we don't know if it's God, if it's omniscient, if he's omniscient, or the God. Right? Okay, yeah. Or
if he's saying we don't know at all what the attributes are, I mean that can't be right. Clearly, you must have something in mind since you're talking about God. Like, why do you think? Yeah, why think that you're talking about God rather than just anything? Like, presumably you have something in mind when you say God, and the sortal must be able to tell you sort of what things would count as that, and like whether there'd be what things are different ones of that type.
And Jake, if we just assume that it was embarrassing that you didn't know how to read the formalization stuff, like all he said he made a big deal of you not being able to read those that relative identity formalization. If let's just pretend that's embarrassing. This is way worse. What's going on here, right? Way worse, because there's intense, an avalanche of confusion about how sortals are here in the exhibit A, and then we see the Q&A exhibit B about redness and dummy sortal. right? This is a billion times worse, in my opinion, than you are not being able on the fly to read the string of symbolizations that he gave on in the notepad.
Right. Okay, let's see. So when you say God, there's no content behind it?
Yeah, the content behind it is going to have to do with epistemology. So we have content behind it, but it's going to have to do with the epistemology of the thing, the metaphysics, not of the
What
logic.
is the content?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the question, but it has nothing.
Like, I keep pressing him on, like, what's the content behind it? And he just refuses to. Now he says, I'll answer it, but it has nothing to do with it. Like, really?
Do with the thing, the metaphysics, not of the logic.
What is the content?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the question, but it has nothing to do with the logic of the Trinity. The content behind it is going to be, the content behind it is obviously going to be what we believe the Christian God to be.
Okay, and who defines that?
What do you mean, who? I'm defining it in the statement.
Who defines what the Christian God is and the paradigm in which one is the same God and the other isn't?
Again, this has nothing to do with the topic, but to me, the Orthodox Church.
I was muted. I was muted. Yeah, I was confused about this question. So you said who defines, well, like what the Christian conception of God is? What you asked?
Well, because that's what he was saying that the sortal is.
Okay. Okay, because I guess I would have asked, can you give me the sense of God that you've accepted, right? Right. Presumably that's going to just.
That's what I kept doing, but he wouldn't.
But he wouldn't answer. So you went this route. Is that the correct?
Yeah.
But those can't be what the Orthodox Church says can't be what determines the content behind the general sortal God. Because then, are you saying that anyone besides Eastern Orthodox, they don't believe in God?
Well, they say stuff like that.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Say stuff like that,
it's not being the same God, right? They don't believe in any God, right? Because that's what you have to say. If this is what determines the content of that sortal, right?
And to be clear, I'm not saying they say that. I mean, I hear things that like that.
Yeah.
That amount to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this is going to go into one of my other criticisms that I mentioned to Danny, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, Troy, but we'll let this develop a little bit more. Orthodox Church.
Yep.
Okay, so how do they know what it is? How do they define it?
Divine revelation.
Divine revelation. Okay, where does divine revelation tell you the criteria for counting as the same sortal God or not?
We don't. We use the formalization of statements for that.
So it doesn't tell you. There's no. What you're doing here is, and what everybody needs to see is, Nick is putting symbols on a page and saying these symbols are consistent with its own system, but there's no actual content that you're providing behind the symbols, correct?
It has nothing to do with the model of the Trinity. The content has to do with the metaphysics, which we can provide, but again, it has nothing to do with the topic.
Okay, so what are the? It's not about the metaphysics. It's about how you are counting and arriving at there being one God. You're saying that they're one God because they are one sortal. What is that one sortal?
Yeah, the one sortal, again, if we want to get into metaphysics, is going to be the people that have the omni properties.
Okay, so now he's saying it's the people that have the omni properties, but before he was saying that we can't define it. Remember, it was like
that can't be what the sortal means, right? Because then trivially there'd be three things that fall under that sortal, right? Because presumably he thinks that each of the persons have the omni properties, correct? And if he does, then if that's the sortal, if that's the content behind the sortal God, then it just follows there's three gods on his view. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
So he can't say that having the omni properties is what makes something fall into unless he wants to say that's okay. Having the omni properties is what is sufficient for falling under the sortal, but you can have two different things under that sortal that but they're still the same of that sortal. I'm not sure. I mean,
he would have to say it's sufficient for counting as the same God. The same God.
Yeah, so I guess you'd have to say that any things that have the same, any two things, or quote unquote two things that have the omni properties count as the same God. If that's how he's understanding the term God. Understanding that sortal.
I thought he was saying something like if A, B, and C all have the omni properties, and they must be the same God. Right?
That's basically what I just said.
Yeah. Okay.
If that's what he's saying, then then that's a way to use that sortal that we could use the string God as a name for that sortal, where the persons would count as being the same God. But what I would think is if, someone, well, there's two things. One is you might be concerned about relative identity generally. But two is, okay, yeah, you could use that sound or string of characters in a way where two things or three things or however many things that had those attributes would count as the same quote unquote God. But what does that get you? In other words, why think that that's what people were getting at when they believe in these things or have written authoritative texts and creeds? In other words, you could just be constructing a different language that's not really addressing or engaging with the actual beliefs and doctrines that are under consideration.
Well, yeah, I mean, and what my
construction.
What my criticism is going to go towards is, I think the view that he's setting up and the way that him and the other people who are training him actually fall into is going to be a type of metaphysical anti-realism, where essentially these sortals are not, it's not like we are investigating and finding them, or it's totally based upon our conceptual framework and what we just fiat say that they are. Because I could say, for example, the sortal God is, and being the same God is just about having omniscience, right? As long as A, B, and C are omniscient, then they count as the same God, and it's under this sortal and blah, 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 blah. And I can just basically fill any, truth conditions to satisfy being a part of the same sortal God that I want. But that's going to just result in a kind of, and some people try to defend, anti-realism. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that you want to be an anti-realist as somebody who believes in God, right? Because then what winds up happening here is that, in my estimation, is that it becomes totally arbitrary and subjective as to whether or not there's one God or three gods, right? Because I can just set up different truth satisfying conditions for what it means for there to be one God. Or like this, I could just pose it in a different way. Well, no, to be a God, right? In this case, I could even go with that as just to possess the same omni properties. But so long as they're distinct from each other, then we should count them as three gods. So what under his framework, where it's just by stipulation, it's just by fiat, what it means to count as one God versus anything else. In other words, it's not something that's generalizable. He's not generalizing it across kinds, like what it means to be the same God versus same human versus same table or anything else. What determines what those conditions are for being the same of each of those different kinds of things? And if you're saying, well, there is no content behind it, there's nothing kind of out there that really tells us or informs us of how to answer those questions, and it's just whatever we input, then doesn't that just result in a sort of crude anti-realism?
Is what you're saying, like, let's use an analogy where I'm married to Sally, Martha, and Judy. Okay, so there's a question about how many wives I have.
I didn't know you became Muslim already, Danny.
Well, I don't think my wife is going to be very fond of that, of Martha and Judy. But the point is that I'm married to Martha, Judy, and Sally, let's say. And then there's a question about how many wives I'm married to, right? And it sounds like what you're saying is that if it seems like if what determines whether I'm married to three wives or one wife is simply some set of arbitrary criteria, right? That, okay, well, if they all share the same nature or wife nature, or if they all have brown hair, or if they're all in my house, right? I can stipulate criteria about, okay, well, under that criteria, I only have one wife today. Now I'm going to change the criteria tomorrow to I have 3 because
Right.
because I've changed that grade. Is that kind of what you're saying, that like there doesn't seem to be a fact of the matter about
Right.
whether I'm married to 1 wife or 3 wives, so long as I dictate without any sort of I think what you want to say is like generalizable or non-special pleading criteria or whatever, insert, I don't know what the correct phrase is there. As long as if I'm in charge
Not
of all
ad
that,
hoc, right? It's
right,
not ad
right.
hoc. You just kind of stipulated by the individual. No, there's actually a fact of the matter out there, and you can kind of explain what that fact is. It's just because even as it goes on, and as maybe not as in detail with this guy, but as I've had it with other people, a good way to kind of get at this is, why can't I count gods by a different relation? Like, what makes it wrong or incorrect for me to count by this other relation? And they have no answer to that. They don't say that that's wrong. They're saying, well, it's perfectly normal and perfectly adequate for you to count gods by identity, in which case you would get 3 gods. So then we ask, like, what makes it more probable on this view that there's 1 God instead of 3, right? Because if the conditions that he's setting up for same God and his conditions for that are equally as plausible as mine, then what relevant difference is there to determine what makes it more likely that there's 1 God versus 3 on this view? I don't know if
I would have to think more about your objection, but one thing that seems clear to me is that, like, it feels like, from what I'm understanding what Nick is saying, that he would have to be comfortable in me saying that, okay, here's my stipulated criteria. I'm married to Judy, Martha, and Sally, right? Under this criteria, you would agree that I'm married to only 1 wife. He'd have to be comfortable with that reality. And if he's not, then, there's probably some sort of inconsistency that I might be seeing. But it goes back to Detroyer's human example, where are we 1 man, 1, what are but what were you going to say, Detroyer?
Well, okay, so a few things that could be said here. Suppose, okay, so he gave this understanding of at least sort of gave this understanding of the sortal God, where things count as the same God if they have the omni properties or something like that.
Right.
Okay, then what if I were to say, okay, here's my understanding of the sortal God. Two things count as the same God, either if they have the omni properties, or like they're my cell phone, Okay, so my cell phone is falls under the sortal here, and it counts as the same God as persons that have the omni properties, if there are any.
Yeah.
And then I might ask, well, what's wrong with that? Okay, here's another way to understand the sortal. I guess what I would want to say is that, well, that's a different sortal. You can use and you can have a word. You can even use the same word to capture that sortal, right? Might be confusing because typically we want our words to be different, especially when they're getting at similar things like this. But fair enough, you can use the word in that way. And then, but what I would want to say is that the sortal that I had in mind, but that would include like my cell phone under the sortal God, is not what people are standardly getting at when they talk about gods and how many gods there are and the Christian God exists and so on. Rather, it wouldn't include things like my cell phone. So what's going on here is I want to think, when people standardly use these terms like God and they're worshiping God, and there's these authoritative texts and creeds that employ God in related terms like Lord and Allah and whatever, what do they have in mind, or what are they getting at, right? I don't think they're getting at things that would include my phone. So then we can ask this question of how those terms are normally used, and what they're getting at. What sort of things would count as a thing of the sort that they're getting at? In what conditions would things count as different instances of a thing of that sort, and so on? I think you can have answers to that even on a relative identity view, but largely you're going to have to think about facts about meaning and reference, and to some degree the metaphysics. I don't think you can separate them entirely when thinking about what the sortal is and how things under that sortal are individuated. Now, I could say a little bit more about Michael Ray's a concern for the relative identity response, but I don't know if that was what I said there was clear enough about the initial thing.
I understood it. Yeah. I mean, my thing is that there's one question about like, what's the criteria or, the truth conditions for there to be one God, or what's the principle of individuation by which they would count as two gods instead of one, right? So like, I think that's an interesting question, because I think when you give those conditions for what it would count as two gods instead of one, then maybe it becomes clearer of what the person is trying to say. I don't know.
Yeah, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm always muting myself. I would appreciate, like, even Gregory's response more so than the sort of responses we heard to in this debate from Nick. If he said something, well, look, by their operation, okay, or by their essence, or by their act, right? At least you have something to work with, right? Like in
by indivisibility or something.
Yeah, right. So, but here, I didn't really get. I mean, we got the omni properties, right? But it's I think that there's a lot more tangible stuff in the history of people responding to this question, and I just felt like Nick wanted to retreat back into the whole explicit inconsistencies of whether there are such explicit inconsistencies in the formalizations that he provided.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the best that I got from what he said there was that, look, two things count as the same. A sufficient condition for counting as the same God is being God and having the omni properties, something like that.
Yeah.
So if two things are God and have the omni properties, then they're the same God. So that's one condition that would suffice for showing on that sortal that they're that the persons are the same God. But there's a further question of, you haven't filled in all the details of how you're understanding that sortal, because you might still ask, okay, but under what conditions would they be distinct gods? Would there be multiple gods? Because presumably you want to allow, at least conceptually speaking, that on some views there would be multiple gods. So you might want to ask how that works for that sortal.
Well, I think that's what they deny. See, Troy, I think that's what they actually explicitly deny. They say something like, I don't know if you've heard this rhetoric too, Danny, that they'll say something like, God isn't even possibly multiply can't be instantiated in a multiple sense at all. Like they'll say that the sortal God doesn't make it possible such that God could be multiply instantiated.
Yeah, now I could be wrong, but that almost sounds like it's undermining the very fact that it almost sounds like a name, like or something different than a sortal, but a different type of noun. But I could be wrong. I'm not so sure how to understand that. What did you have any thoughts about that?
You could have a sortal that like necessarily only has one instance. Like maybe the sortal worked in a way that it had it must be unique and maximum in some degree, and so if there were something like that, there couldn't be more than one, because then it wouldn't be unique and maximal.
But
so you could have a sortal.
Would there be a fact of the matter that explains that? Like because what makes it such that this sortal isn't possibly like it cannot possibly be multiply instantiated? Like what about it? There has to be a fact of the matter, right?
Yeah. So suppose I said suppose I had a sortal. Well, think of the sortal human, but think of a more specific sortal that says is any human that's at least a foot taller than any other human, right? So in this sortal, either there's nothing in that, there's no instance of it because there's no human that's at least a foot taller than every other human, or there's one, right? Because then there's at least one. But there can't be more than one human that's at least a foot taller than every other human, because how would they compare to each other in height? They can't be at least a foot taller than each other. So I guess I want to allow that you could have you could stipulate a sortal that by construction could not be multiply instanced. However, it's not clear to me that he's done that in the case of the sortal God. And And secondly, it seems implausible, right? Because I want to allow that, for example, Hindus believe in gods, and on their picture of what the world is like, there are multiple gods, and I want to be able to make sense of that, at least conceptually speaking.
You know what their
Even if I
response
think
is?
it's false.
I heard them say actually in their review. I don't know if you heard this at all, Danny, but Than, who's like Mike's, I don't know, whatever. They
Yeah,
work
I'm
together.
friends with Than. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So he actually brought this point up and said, well, Muslims shouldn't want to grant that, because if they don't believe that polytheism is even logically possible in any possible world, then they would have to deny that it's even possible for there to be God multiply instanced. Like that was his argument, what he said, which I thought was kind of strange. I mean,
no, look, if they have some notion of God, that sort of by construction is could not be multiple instances in this way. Okay, I mean, I'm not sure what you're saying then when you talk about God, because at the very least, it's not what comes up in these normal conversations when people talk about monotheism versus polytheism and so on. Because we don't want to say that polytheism is a conceptual confusion or something like that. Maybe we think it's impossible metaphysically, or at least false. But I don't want to say it's conceptually confused. But it would be conceptually confused for, I guess, whatever more strict or narrow notion of quote unquote God that they have in mind. And that's not to say that, well, obviously their notion of the Christian God or the Eastern Orthodox God and what comes along with that would rule out there being multiple gods. Sure. But we're speaking about more generically when you think about theism more broadly and what a God would be. I don't think in the normal sense that's restrictive in that way. But they're fine to use it in a more narrow sense. And often, and part of the problem here is when we're talking about the logical problem of the Trinity, the point is that they want to say that the Trinitarians want to say that they are monotheists in this more standard sense, as opposed to polytheists. It's not enough to say that polytheism is incoherent or something like that as a conceptual confusion. Rather, I think pretty much everyone who's participant to the debate understands that you could have a view that says there are multiple gods. And there's a question of whether their view is one such view. Moreover, I just want to add, even if you think that polytheism is some sort of conceptual confusion, in a way that kind of pushes the problem backwards, because then if their view committed to there being multiple gods, then okay, then maybe their view is a conceptual confusion as well. Anyway.
I don't know if you guys want to just continue listening. I think there's a couple more points here. Let's see. And the omni properties is sufficient for counting as one God.
Yeah, that's what we define as one God, is going to be the being that has the omni properties.
And those are all essential properties. So sharing the same essential properties is sufficient for counting as one God?
Specifically the omni properties, yeah.
Okay. So what's the difference between that and the case of human beings, Peter, James, and John, when it comes to the example that I gave from Gregory of Nissa?
That human beings are potentially instanced, while gods are not potentially instanced, because God has no potential under divine simplicity.
You cut out there.
This is not what he should say.
Yeah. See, that's where it's coming up. That's why I was remembering it, that he's the one who actually said this. And other people who are trying to run the same script say the same thing, that God's, let's just listen to it one more time.
Yeah.
That I gave from that, and the case of human beings, Peter, James, and John, when it comes to the example that I gave from Gregory of Nissa.
That human beings are potentially instanced, while gods are not potentially instanced, because God has no potential under divine simplicity.
You cut out on my, and that doesn't that seem confused as well? Like even his explanation that gods are not potentially instanced because God doesn't have any potential. Like, doesn't that seem like an equivocation on potential at that point?
Yeah, it is.
It is. Now, so I think he is equivocating there. Now, they do give some, the Thomas and other people will give some sort of inference for thinking that there can't be more than one God in this sense, where there's like more than one being of pure act or something. But yeah, what he said there is confused, right? Because this, you could think that there's a God that exists without any potentials or whatever, or at least passive potentials, but also think that it's a potential fact, more broadly speaking, like it's at least a possibility that there's more than one being of that sort. That's not at least on this level analysis, a contradiction. It may be that given further commitments that like Thomas would make, that it would be ruled out that there's more than one being of that sort. But what I was going to say is, I think he should say is that the difference between this case and the man case is that for the sort of God, what you have is a principle that tells you is a sort of a sufficient condition for counting as the same God, right? Is having those, is being a God and having those attributes. Whereas that's not the case in the man case. It's not a sufficient condition for being the same man that you're a man and have the
omni properties,
those attributes. Well, or whatever the analogous versions would be in the case of man,
let's say whatever the
human
essential attributes are for being human.
Yeah, that would only be enough for that would be a sufficient condition for being a thing of that sort, for being a man, but not enough for being the same man. So if he wants to say that, he could say, that's what I think that he should say, although there's still problems, is that that's the relevant difference. In the man case, we haven't implied that having those features is a sufficient condition for counting as the same man. It's just a sufficient condition for counting as a man. Whereas in the case of God, having the omni properties is a sufficient condition for counting as the same God.
The question is why. Like the question is why. Because it seems to be like the omni properties are the essential properties that are being shared amongst three divine persons. And so if we kind of map that over into the human case, why wouldn't it also be a sufficient condition to having the essential properties for being human to count as the same human? Now, just kind of restating that one is omni properties and the other is essential human properties doesn't really answer the question. Like, what's the symmetry breaker supposed to be?
Right. What's the motivation for that?
Yeah.
Why? Yeah.
So I would frame the question like this: why think that when we normally think and talk about God, at least as God is discussed in relevant authoritative texts and creeds, that it's an appropriate model of God to say that if two things had the same had these omni properties, then they count as the same God. That seems to be a fair question. In fact, it seems sort of implausible to me, because I could sort of imagine, and maybe it's implausible, but it's at least conceivable. It seems to me not a conceptual confusion to imagine that there's multiple gods up there in the heavens that have the omni properties, but they're not the same God. What's wrong with that? Now someone might try to argue, well, actually that's not possible because omnipotence precludes there being other omnipotent beings or something else along those lines. But I don't know. It just seems like a wrong. Either way, it seems like an incorrect model of God in the normal sense. Like you could stipulate there's some other sortal and this is the way it works. It just seems to me like you're talking about something else. I could stipulate a sortal God and it includes like the stuff on my grocery list, but you're not talking about what people are normally getting at.
Would Trinitarians think that that Jesus is an omnipotent person, or just would they say he's an omnipotent God that is not an omnipotent person? What would they say?
Well, I assume they'd say both, right?
Say both.
Okay, and so any sort of paradoxes that you get with omnipotence with multiple gods, right? Wouldn't that just arise at the level of persons? Like if there can't be two omnipotent gods, then for whatever reasons, then you couldn't have multiple omnipotent persons for the same reasons, it would seem.
Yeah. If they respond by something like, well, it's possible when their wills align or something like that. Well, okay. Then I just imagine my example with three separate
with three
beings that supposedly their wills align. I still want to say those are three separate gods.
A world where the Greek pantheon, all their wills are aligned, or they have the common goal, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, maybe he'll add something else to comment on. On my end, can you repeat the last 10 seconds?
Yes, it's okay. Because humans are potentially instanced while God is not. So we would believe that humans are particulars while gods are not particulars.
Okay. And that statement was weird to me where it said gods are not particulars, but surely he believes the Father, Son, Holy Spirit are particulars, right?
I've never really understood them on their analysis of the Trinity and how particulars work. I just
Also, if you want to say gods are not particulars, in what sense do you believe in one God? God is a particular thing. I guess I don't understand some of this talk. And maybe I'm not sure where you come on this or come down on this. I don't understand some of this talk where people say things like, well, God doesn't even strictly speaking exist, right? Or is not a thing or something.
Being like God is above being or something.
Or God is neither universal or particular. He's something beyond, and we can't tell you. Yeah, this is all kind of stuff.
It's kind of nonsense to me, honestly.
I would rather think that God is a thing. God is a being, is an agent. Yeah. If you want to say not even that, I don't really. I guess I don't even know how to distinguish your view from like atheism. Like I don't know.
And what establishes that gods are potentially not potentially instance, but humans are.
Yeah, the fact that we believe God is pure act and he has no potential, because potential would lead to change, meaning that he's not perfect.
Now, see, I asked him the question, like, how is that a good answer to the question? Am I just kind of missing something?
Yeah, it's not, because you could think that, I mean, he could try to give some of the further inferences that Thomas sometimes give. I think Aquinas even gave something like this. But from what he said here, you could think that there's a being that's pure act, and also some other God, or even another being of pure act. It doesn't require that either of them are changing or have these passive potencies, at least at this level of analysis.
Even if they were changing, why would that preclude them from being the same God? What he said so far.
I think he's saying, I think what he has in mind is that perfection and unchanging is part of the requirements to be God in the first place. So if it changed or wasn't perfect, then it wouldn't even be God.
Right.
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
But
and I know you know Detroyer, but just so in case anybody's watching the video, we don't think that he's a Thomist. It's just that this is
but these are some of the things he said are sort of, I think, influenced by that. I assume he's not. Yeah. He's not a Thomist.
That was more for any critics that are watching this. Oh, why would you assume that I'm a Thomist? Right? No, that's not what he said. Right.
But then in this case, isn't a good point to bring up, or a question that now it seems that when we actually go into it, relative identity is not what's actually doing the work of why they're counting as one God. What's actually doing the work is the metaphysical commitments about, let's say Thomism, that God is pure act or divine simplicity or whatever else. Now that seems what's to be doing the work behind why there's only one God.
Well, it's how they're understanding that sortal, right? And so they understand the sortal. They understand certain principles of individuation within that sortal, and then use the relative identity operator, right, to block any sort of inconsistencies that you might get from absolute identity, right? Yeah. So that's how I'm understanding.
As you can finish if you want, but I was just going to say, look, there's three of us in the room here, right? And I could say, look, my claim is that the three of us are the same person. And you say, well, how does that work? And I just say, well, on relative identity, you can have things that are the same F but different G's, and there we go. That's not an answer, right? Because you need to be able to explain or show, even granting relative identity as a legitimate sense of identity, you need to be able to show that in the relevant sense of person and so on, we can count and would count as the same person. It's not enough to just appeal to relative identity as if that makes my claim logical that we're the same person.
Right.
Except again in the narrow sense that you could express it in some formal system, yada yada yada, which is already granted.
Right. So that's what I mean. Like, relative identity isn't really what's doing the work behind the questions that we're concerned with. What's really doing the work actually is the metaphysics, the metaphysical claims and commitments behind it. And like, it's what he's doing is so opposed to what Gregory of Nissa did. Like, Gregory of Nissa's response, no matter how ridiculous I think it is, I think it's actually more plausible than what Nick is saying here, because at least he's trying to be consistent and generalize. He's thinking, well, if having the same essence is sufficient for being the same God, then and that kind of thing, then having the same essence when it comes to being human should be sufficient for being the same human. And yeah, I'm just going to bite the bullet. Like Troy, Jake, and Danny are the same human. I know it sounds weird, but and he even says that, like, I know it sounds weird, but we should correct our way of speaking about humans rather than correcting our way of speaking about God. Like, that's literally what he says. Now, that sounds ridiculous, right? Like, granted, but at least you can see what he's doing. Like, he's trying to be consistent by saying, oh, same essence is sufficient for being, the same God, or the same kind of thing, God in this case. So then let's generalize it and say it's the same thing for humans, in which case there's literally only one man on this StreamYard right now. I mean, so, but Nick doesn't have, and this type of way of viewing it in this relative identity way, the problem that I see with this whole sortal scheme is there isn't any way of generalizing this, or at least I haven't seen a good way of how you would generalize this. And then it just seems like what qualifies under the sortal or for counting as the same God or same human or anything else just becomes totally arbitrary. Like, there isn't really a fact of the matter that you're pointing to. And it just becomes a matter of our own conceptual schemes. And that's why I'm saying, to me, it just seems to result in a type of anti-realism.
Yeah. So when someone proposes a relative identity approach to the Trinity, there's like two main questions that I have. One is, okay, how are you understanding the relevant terms like person and God, such that it even makes sense to say that there would be three persons that are the same God? I want to understand how those terms are functioning. In the same way that, like, if I said we're all the same person here, it would be fair for someone to ask me, well, how are you understanding person such that, like, the three individuals would count as the same person? That seems like a fair question. So that's what I would want to understand with how they're understanding the terms God and person. And frankly, I think it's probably not going to be a normal sense. I probably have to stipulate something kind of strange or new. And then the second question I would have is, okay, suppose you provide that, some understanding of the relevant sortals where it does make sense to suppose that three persons are the same God but distinct persons. And then the question is, why think that that's relevant to what people have been talking about, believing in, and especially as it's presented in the authoritative texts and creeds? Because if it's not, or we don't have good reason to think that it is, then for all we know, or maybe you just have constructed some other way of speaking that doesn't map onto what people actually believe in or what these texts are actually saying. It wouldn't be a model of the Trinity in any usual sense. It's a model of something else that you're using that same word to label, but it's not actually what people are getting at. So those are my two main concerns. And then you can have there's further worries that you can bring up regarding a relative identity approach as it relates to certain theological concerns about the minds and the wills and whatever else. And especially if they have further theological commitments, like you bring up with Nick. But those first two things would be my primary two concerns for the relative identity approach to the Trinity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his definition about the omni properties, that's pretty standard, right? Like, there's nothing crazy about that for being considered God. But my whole thing is about why is that sufficient?
But if that's sufficient for being the same God.
Yeah, that's what I mean. For being God in a general sense, like, that's standard, right? We all kind of agree. But I'm saying, why would that be considered standard or normal or sufficient to count as the same God? Like, even if I could think of a situation where that could be part of the necessary conditions for being the same God, but I don't see like how that would be sufficient for counting God.
Yeah. I wouldn't even want to say that, because I want to say it's at least concept. So it perhaps it's sufficient for counting as a God that you have the omni properties. Perhaps maybe you need something more than that, but suppose that's sufficient. I don't want to say it's necessary. I don't know. There are people who believe in God that don't think he has some or more of those omni properties. Like, if someone thinks that God is are limited in certain ways. Is that not? Are they not believing in God anymore?
All right,
Yeah,
Right.
I didn't hear that he's what?
that he's not God.
Like if someone thinks that God is limited in certain ways, like
Limited.
Philip Goff has been going around recently talking about his limited God hypothesis. If you want to say that God necessarily, in order to, like, in the general sense, right, it's a conceptual fact that God must have the omni properties, then strictly speaking, he's not a limited God hypothesis. It's a limited schmod. There's something else, right? It's something else hypothesis. I don't want to say that. I think in the normal sense, if there were being like what he believes in, that would count as another God, right? Not a God.
A lot of
all the
traditional
properties and so on. But
yeah, but a lot of classical
Yeah.
theists, traditional monotheists want to say that those are necessary.
Like you would say that's another God of a different kind, right? Like that's a different kind of God.
It's relevantly different, but of course, right? It's significantly different than one that satisfies omni properties, and especially different than one that's
You don't want to rule out polytheists as theists, right? And maybe you do.
Exactly.
Right.
When I'm saying God in a generic sense, right, that would include things like what the Hindus believe in and so on, and what people believe in when they talk about a limited God, those would count as gods, right? Now, there can be significant differences between one more specific notion of God than another, right? Especially if someone thinks that God is like the foundation of all being and is divinely simple and is pure act. Obviously, that's incredibly different from some like limited God hypothesis. But I still want to say the God hypotheses all the same, right? At least in a generic sense, that when we're thinking about is this view monotheistic or polytheistic, if a view posits a bunch of these limited gods, okay, I want to say that's a polytheistic view, right?
Rather than a polytheistic view and they're really atheist.
Yeah, or just an atheistic view, because if they're not positing a God that has the omni properties, then it's not a theistic view at all. And okay, I don't think that's right. But as I say, I mean, they're free to, and people are generally like free to use the language differently. If you want to say, oh, by God, in the most generic sense, I just mean something that satisfies the omni properties or something else like that, then you're free to use the language that way. I guess I can stop you, but.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think
that's
less absurd.
Yeah.
I think I don't know, for me, the more absurd part is saying that that's sufficient for not just counting as God, but it's sufficient for counting as the same God. I don't know. That seems more bizarre to me.
Yeah, because that would sort of require that it's sort of like conceptually confused to say that there's if I just said, I believe there's two gods that have the omni properties, would you say that I'm like conceptually confused, like, or that I'm speaking about quote unquote God in some other sense? That seems wrong to me. No, that's not enough for counting as the same God.
Yeah, it's just going to sound weird in a debate between a Muslim and a Christian, though. Oh, I agree with you, Detroyer. But they're in a debate between a Muslim and a Christian to say that God doesn't have to be good or doesn't have to be all-knowing, right? That's just that's so distracting. You sort of assume that those are the starting criteria for necessary qualities for God.
But why would that be enough to be the same God? That's
right.
That's the thing I really don't.
There's two stages here. What are these even requirements for being a God in the first place? And second, are they requirements, or are they sufficient conditions for being the same God? I think both of them are not true. I don't think they're requirements for being God in the first place in general, right? Because you can have a theistic view that didn't posit a God of that sort. But even if that were incorrect, it just seems silly to me to suppose that, at least as a matter of conceptual fact, that those are sufficient conditions for having those properties as sufficient condition for being the same God. Maybe there's something wrong with someone's view that says there's multiple gods that have those omni properties. But the error is not because they've used the term God in a way that's conceptually incoherent, right?
Yeah, like why couldn't I say that sufficient conditions for being the same God are possessing being an individual who possesses the divine nature, like that is what's sufficient for being the same God.
Yeah, they could equally say that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I would want to say, right? So if I want to say that having the omni properties or having the divine essence or whatever way you want to say it, being an individual with the divine essence or individual with the omni properties is sufficient for being or counting as the same God, and such that if you are not the same individual with the omni properties, you're not the same God. So my question would be to them, and that's why I keep pressing on this anti-realism point, but I don't know, maybe how would they provide an argument for why their conditions for being the same God are to be preferred versus what I
With the
just said?
anti-realist account that you're presupposing there's some extramental fact that is sort of a ground or determines rather how to count with
Like
respect to
they're
total.
going to have to say it's either a brute fact, right? Like it's a brute fact about, let's say it is an actual fact, but it's just brute and it's just, there's no further explanation for it. Or they would have to say that there's not a fact of the matter, that it's just completely arbitrary and stipulated. I mean, what would the other options be?
Well, I'm not sure where anyone. Go ahead, Detroit. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm not so concerned about the anti-realism point, not because I'm going in for sort of anti-realism, but because I guess I don't. Maybe I'd have to look back at the way Ray argues for this, but it seems to me that once you fix what sortal you have in mind, then it's not a matter of convention or subjective opinion. Like, what are the things that fall under that sortal, and which things are different things that fall under that sortal? So what I want to say is, like, suppose someone says, okay, here's the way I'm understanding the sortal God. They're individuated by whether they have the omni properties, such that if two things are God and have the omni properties, and they're the same God. But then another person says, no, I'm understanding it this way. Two things are the same God if they're God and they have the same divine substance. Okay. And that's a sufficient condition for counting as the same God. And maybe those are different views. I want to say there could be a fact of the matter about, well, either they're just using the term God in a different way, right? In which case, it's just a coincidence, perhaps, that we have the same sound or symbols to capture these different sortals. In which case, that's fine, right? That's no more surprising that the conditions for counting as a dog are different than the conditions for counting as a God. It's not surprising that the conditions for counting as God 1 are different than the conditions for counting as a God 2. But it's not a further question once you fix the sortal that's under consideration, I don't think, of like subjective opinion or convention, like what are the conditions for counting as a God 1 or for counting as a God 2? So I guess what's quote unquote relative there is the way in which we're in fact speaking, like whether we're using terms like God 1 or God 2, not like a further question of, given the sortal, a specific sortal, what the conditions are for satisfying it or for counting is the same thing under that. I don't know if I'm explaining that in the most clear way, but
why, like, so then you think, I guess the question would be, what, although you're granting that there could be different conceptions of the sortal God or counting as the same God or things of that nature,
yeah,
how would we rule out cases in which they're not acceptable? Like, is it just, if it's not a matter of convention, then presumably you would have to appeal to some fact of the matter.
Okay, so there's different things you might be getting at here, because like you might be asking what sortals are even legitimate as sortals, right? Because you might think that there's only so many categories of things.
Sorry, Mike just joined. I'm just going to add him, and you could continue. Sure. And then kind of bring him on. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Pretty good. We'll let you come in a second. I just want to finish this last thought with what Detroit are saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it could be a question about like which sortals are even legitimate as sortals, in which case, well, I mean, you could think that there's sort of no limit. You could take a sort of platitudinous view about what the potential sortals are. Things that be categorized in all sort of different ways that, in principle, you could construct categories. But maybe the more relevant question is, or you could also not think that's correct. Maybe there's some sort of restriction. this non-plenitudinous in that way. Or you could think maybe the question is, which ones of these are legitimate or admissible as a model of what we're normally talking about, right? Because like if I want to say, you might grant, okay, there's a sort of like chair, and that'll include things like this and this and this. But if I supplied those conditions as the conditions for the sort of God, like obviously that's illegitimate because it's not capturing the sort of thing that we're talking about in the right sort of way. Or even if I modify the sort of God so that it would include things like my cell phone, that's illegitimate in that respect, right? Because it's just getting something else. So that filling in the details of the sortal in that way is just an incorrect model of what we're actually trying to get at, what we're actually trying to talk about. So then there's a question of, yeah.
So how would the person under Nick's view, like even if I granted his view of sortal and same God and everything,
yeah,
how would he rule out my way of describing it as an individual with the divine nature is a God, and unless you possess all the same properties, you're not the same God? How does he rule that out as a legitimate way of speaking about God?
Yeah, I'm not sure how he would approach it, but I think if you were going to, you would have to do something, sort of two stages. I think I would put more emphasis on the semantics and the referential practices and like what we're actually getting at when we employ these terms and have these thoughts. I think that's a primary interest. And then the second thing might be exploring metaphysical issues. But like, for example, how would I apply this to? You could think about how we could apply this to other cases. Like, suppose you instead of saying that, you said, "Oh, here's how I'm understanding the sort of God," to include things like my cell phone. Well, he could probably say something like, "Well, hang on a second. That's just not the sort of thing that we have in mind when we employ these terms. Like that's I agree. It's just an incorrect model of that." And thinking about whether something's a correct or incorrect model of that. In some of these cases, it's going to be a lot more difficult than the case where I included the cell phone.
Yeah, like the cell
that's so
phone
obvious.
Like
that's so obvious.
That's crazy. But yeah. I'm saying I don't see him able to do that with my alternative. That's what I mean.
Yeah, it might be less. It might be less obvious or harder to think about in the case of, well, you're saying something about the omni properties versus the nature versus the substance, yada yada yada. Maybe those have some like, each of those at least has some initial. It's not obviously like nonsense in the way that the cell phone one is, but I still think that you can approach it and make some progress on differentiating those as plausible candidates for an analysis of the sort of God in the usual sense. How you do that exactly, not so easy. I think it's going to require thinking more carefully about the semantics and about the metaphysics that I'm not sure that he.
And I'm more easily satisfied. Right. When someone says to me that, yeah, look, standardly, you have a problem, Danny. Like when you read the Nicene Creed, when you look at our views, yeah, if you think standardly about the way that we use these terms, it's a problem. Which is why we've engineered, right, this specific conception of God and engineered a means of counting or criteria of which there's one despite there being three persons, right? I'm happy with that, right? Because the standard experience that I get is that if you use these terms standardly, right? If you count standardly, of course there's no issue, Danny. Like you're just hallucinating a problem, right? But I see where you're coming from though, Jake, but I'm more easily satisfied in just if they just concede to me that on a standard understanding of these relevant categories and terms, we can see a problem.
I mean, because that's what Gregory basically does, right? He's like, yeah, under the normal way in which we talk, there would be three men and three gods, and his response is like, oh, we have to. He's not saying that, no, that's crazy. Nobody speaks like this. This isn't the concepts that we use and have in mind. His response is we have to change them. So we have to stop people from thinking that there's only one human. Three humans. We have to say that there's only one human so that people can't try to say there's three gods. So
one of the things that really has me interested in this whole debate, right, is the gaslighting that goes on with people that have issues with the doctrine, that, oh, there's no problem. What are you talking? Of course, 3 in 1. It's not that. Look, you can have, and then they give all these analogies, and of course they're disanalogies, and then they gaslight us into thinking that there's like no prima facie issue at the least, right? And that's like insulting to me, right? I think that, to be honest about the issue, like the way that I think Branson is to some extent, and Gregory of Nissa, right? Like, yeah, okay. Normally there's going to be an issue, but here's our engineering or
Oh yeah, and if they want to just bite the bullet and say, in the usual sense or a more usual sense, like, we're technically polytheists, but we're in this other sense of counting in God, we're monotheists in that sense. Okay, I guess.
Yeah, that's kind of what Josh does. That's kind of what Sijuade does, to be honest. Whereas Branson, even though I think he's inconsistent, and I pointed out why, I appreciate the approach that where you're trying to more universalize or generalize the counting method, right? Like, for example, the reason why, I can give an argument for why I think my model or way of individuating is correct, because it's simple, right? It has less moving parts. I'm only appealing to one standard way of counting for everything, right? Like, whether it's you could have criteria for being of the same kind, God or sortal God, or same thing for human, but what individuates them is going to be the same thing every time. It's going to be Leibniz's law, right? So, and therefore they're going to I can generalize that, right? And then you can kind of argue with me or think, well, you have these counter examples or whatever else. We can go into that, but at least I'm giving you a target of something to work with. Whereas, and that's what I'm saying about the sortal thing, where you're just constructing it, and same God versus same man versus same table has totally different conditions. It just seems kind of arbitrary. Whereas with Branson, he comes up with this thing. Well, no, we should be counting by division,
yeah,
right? And here's the counting method, and here's how we generalize it. And then at least you can attempt to poke holes in it, which I have. He says, well, they should, they count as one thing of a particular kind, so long as the two in question cannot be separated by time or space. And well, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or the divine essence, or their energies, whatever way you want to frame it, of how you want to use the term God, none of that is separated by time or space. Therefore, they're counted as one thing of that particular kind. And I say, okay, but then my response to Branson was, well, then that would result in there being one God, but one person, because the persons themselves cannot be separated by time or space. So they should likewise count as one person. And he wasn't expecting that. And if you go to his debate review where he joined with Jay Dyer, Jay Dyer had no idea how to respond to this. And Branson just responded and was like, well, okay, I guess you kind of would say that. And he kind of just like bit the bullet, so to speak, and was like, oh, well, then in terms of the content, it's still the same idea that we have. Like, we have these persons who are distinct, right? And the content is the same, but now it's just a verbal kind of disagreement, or we have to change our language and say that there's only one person. But I'm like, yeah, but that's kind of the whole point, that you haven't been doing or saying that all along, which demonstrates that in actual fact that hasn't been done, that the church fathers and the doctrine is based upon the assumption that they count divine persons by identity or discernibility, or Leibniz's law, not based upon division. So I'm pressing you to be consistent, but at the same time, I'm showing you, no, that's not the way that they counted. They did count the persons by identity. But you see what I'm trying to say? At least with this, there's progression of the conversation. We can kind of move to something. But with this sortal thing, where I don't know, it just seems fiat, and we're just constructing it kind of in a what seems to be arbitrary way, whatever way that we want, and it's not generalizable to accounting by division or counting by identity. I don't know. I kind of just
you said it earlier, right? You said it earlier that it's not the relative identity, and just saying one sortal, relative to one sortal, that doesn't do any work. right? And then
Right.
the second that you press these people to do the work, right, they don't come up with something like Branson, which is at least a little interesting about this counting stuff, or
Right.
that,
Yeah.
you know.
And it's
But
something.
yeah, the now the parrots of relative identity have right. They don't offer anything for us to generalize about, I think is what you're saying. And
Right.
and it's empty, right?
Right.
Yeah, and like I think you made a good point, Jake. Like, I mean, either they're going to have to say, well, actually, strictly speaking, there's just one person, one divine person, in which case, well, it sounds like you're contradicting the actual doctrines that have been believed for centuries.
Yeah.
Or they're going to have to say that, well, no, actually, we do individuate gods by identity. We count them by identity here, but that you can't generalize that because it doesn't apply, at least it doesn't apply to persons.
Right.
Okay.
Right, but then you're going to have to do some
Why?
other kind of generalizing where you say, okay, and this is what Jay Dyer's like, well, and he always says this line, and I'm like, okay, but let's go further. Where he says, well, we count different things in different ways. Okay, I can kind of get with that for a second. We count persons by identity, because Branson, I don't think he realized the obvious contradiction to what he said. But now they're admitting, like, okay, we count persons by identity, but we count gods, or the category of gods, by division. Okay. Now, why is that? Like, well, can you give me some kind of principle by which? Because before, what they were trying to do, it's like anytime they tried to generalize it, I always poked a hole in their generalization. Like, one thing they did was, well, we count physical things by division because they can possibly be separated by time and space as physical objects. But things that are not physical, we count by identity. Well, okay. Well, in the case of God, if
God's not physical.
if God's not physical, then both the categories of God and personhood in the Trinity would be counted by identity, in which case you got 3 gods and 3 persons. Another thing they tried to do was, well, we count abstract objects by identity, but we count concrete objects by division. Well, then you're going to have the same problem, because God presumably is a concrete object, right? So then you get one God, because let's just assume you get one God because there's one concrete object, right? Or I don't know, maybe you're thinking that, well, the persons themselves are all concrete, so you wind up getting 3 persons and 3 gods. But anytime they tried, and at least they're trying to, and I think the motivation behind trying to generalize or universalize a principle and say, well, this is the principle by which we count these set of things, and we count these set of things by this other method. They're trying to generalize it because they're trying to show that it's not ad hoc. It's not just divinely stipulated that there's only one God rather than 3.
That's what they should do, right? Like, they should just cut to the chase. Well, look, the Bible says it, the Creed says it, we believe it, that there's no thinking about it. In terms of this, there's no way to generalize it in the way that you want. Nice meeting you. I think, and then we're done, right? Like, it's just like,
right.
But my worry is that even if they come up with some principle or set of criteria that would count the gods as 1 and the persons as 3, maybe the indivisibility is not a one that satisfies that. Then there's a further question: is like, okay, maybe that's like an interesting like construction or something like that. But why do you think that that's relevant to counting in the normal sense, or the notion of God and person in the normal sense? Because if you're just talking about, if you're constructing your own sort of language to express these things, it might just be its own thing that's not connected with the actual beliefs and doctrines and counting that we normally do. So that seems to me it's not enough to say. And I know Branson wants to say like, oh, at this time, like this was the way that a lot of people did individuate things, like by division or something like that, which is questionable. But like, at least that would be something that I would want someone to argue, that if they came up with these criteria, that is actually relevant to normal accounting, at least historically in the relevant creeds.
Yeah, but like in that case, right, he and others who use this division thing, they try to appeal to like these paradoxes or these problems where you need to count by division, or the common way that we do actually count is by division and not by identity, right? Or even with relative identity, right? Like let's say relative identity, even outside of the Trinity, by some philosophers, has been used to try to solve some type of metaphysical puzzles that we have, like the lump and the statue and all these different things. Where
anymore, Charlie.
Right. Identity over time and these type of things, where it seems like there's some type of motivation for the problem, right? Sorry, for the solution. We have this problem. The normal way in which we deal with things, or the normal way in which we count, doesn't really solve it. So we construct this, or we have this type of way of kind of getting around or solving this problem. But in the Trinity, there doesn't seem to be anything of that sort, right? What seems to be the problem is we don't want to admit that there's three gods. So we construct this just so we don't have the verbal proclamation of saying that there are three gods in any sense. You see what I'm trying to say? That there's a difference between those two cases, right?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
If they could show that terms like person and God and so on, like, did normally work in that sort of way, that where this sort of analysis was appropriate, then I guess, okay, that would be something, right? But then, like, show that that's how it works.
Right.
It's not enough to say, like, well, I could construct it in this way, and I could use relative identity in this way. My worry is that, okay, perhaps, but A, I'd want to see how that works, and B, I'd want it to be understood in a way that's relevant to what normal people are getting at and believing in and so on, especially as it's presented in authoritative texts and creeds. Because if it's just talking about something else, what good is that? You're just talking about something else.
Right.
So, yeah.
In which case, that's what my point to Nick would be, to come back, is like, even if I granted you that his framework is a legitimate way of speaking about the same God, what I'm going to say, to me, is just as legitimate, in which case you're going to have to show me why what I'm saying is not as legitimate, to rule out that this isn't a legitimate way of speaking about God, such that you do get three gods. Like, you have to, in my mind, he has to have a way of trying to rule that out. And I just don't think that they do at all. Like, I don't know. Mike is here. Let's just bring him on. Hey, Mike.
Hey, yeah, I was walking back home.
Yeah, man, I saw you out in the woods there.
Yeah, I've been enjoying listening. Earlier, I was working. I've caught this whole stream.
Okay, so yeah, if you have a bone to pick with me or any of us based upon what we're saying, or you want to add something to the topic, go ahead.
Well, hey, thanks. I appreciate it. So there's really only one key thing I think that's being missed, and it's in communication of these things. So, maybe I was a bit overcritical, in my X post. A lot of people didn't understand what I meant, but there was a term that was not used in the debate. Neither has it been in this review, and that is the term informal logic. Okay, so you have formal logic and informal logic. Each have their own fallacies and make up what it means to be, quote, logical. So you need to know the difference and call that out. What Nick did is frame his burden of being logical in terms of only formal logic. That was his whole position about, the syntax is good, it's, quote, consistent, right? Formal logic only deals, though, with the form, the structure, the syntax. That's what it means when we call something valid. So you pointed this out. You can make up ridiculous arguments. I could say all birds are made of cheese. I'm a bird, therefore I'm made of cheese, right? That's logical in a strict formal sense. But it's ridiculous because the premises are false. And that's informal logic. It deals with the content, the truth value of the claims. And in some cases where it can't be shown, obviously, it'll deal in like likeliness or, the probability of a truth value. So that's what it means when we call something strong or weak. So an argument is sound when it's both structurally perfect and its premises are true. That's what needed to be called out here, right? Because he painted this false picture that, if I show that it's formally logical, then I've met the burden. No, that's only half the equation. He said many ridiculous things. He said that his view presupposes no metaphysics. Oh my God, that just blows my mind. Of course, his argument depends upon particularly the distinction between person and being. So I was sort of critical, and the reason why is because I just think that should have been pointed out way more clear. Only people listening in at a high level are going to know that you gave all what was needed to know that his position was false, but it was spread out. It was sparse and in a bit disorganized. I would make that the sole contention, right? So no, it doesn't need to just be formally logical. It has to be informally true. And that forces him into metaphysics. And that was your wheelhouse. That's where you crush right there.
Yeah. I mean, in defense of myself, I think that what I said in the debate and then pretty much everything we're being saying here, there's nothing radically different in terms of the content, right? Like the meaning behind what you're saying and what I've said and what the other guys have said here. It's just maybe the particular phrasing or the wording and the way that you think it would be conveyed better. That's what I see.
Absolutely. You have to use the term informal logic, because he kept just calling his position logical, but he's only met half the burden. You have to be like, no, that's only formally logical. You have to prove the premises are true. That's informal logic, right? I mean, they have their own fallacies, right? When we say something's a non sequitur, what is that? An informal fallacy. When someone affirms the consequent, that's a formal fallacy. It's a flaw in the structure. So when you point that out, it's just going to force him into the metaphysics to defend his view. But I thought you did a great job dismantling relative identity. That much is sure.
Yeah, I think to echo your frustration, if there was any room for improvement, and this is a difficult thing to do because they're going to say they're sheep anyway. Like a lot of the Christians that were listening, I would say 95% of them, I would guess, thought you were conceding the whole thing, right?
Yes.
And so the room for improvement, I think, is to somehow herd the sheep away from that percentage, and that's very difficult, right? But I think what Mike is saying is maybe different language or different presentation, nip it in the butt in the opening statement, that kind of thing, right?
Well, and think of how beautiful it would have been, right? Because you can literally grant him relative identity. You could just give it to them because it only pertains to the formal structure of the argument. That doesn't prove that it's true, right? When I just debated the Eastern Orthodox Bryce J, in the premise, I said we were debating whether the hypostatic union was logical, same term. I said in order to be logical, it needs to be sound. And that means it's both formally, right, its structure is perfect, and its premises are true. So that forces them in there. When you raise that bar to where it should be, everything else that you were saying, I just think would have been, 1,000 times more powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would want to say that even if you grant relative identity, it's a further question of whether that's the right analysis of the terms employed by Trinitarians, like person and God and so on. So then I would just ask him, like, well, how are you understanding the terms in a relative identity sense? And like, why I think that's the right way to understand them? Just appealing to relative identity or to some just formal structure on which certain sentences can be formalized in a way that's consistent. That gets you nothing, right? Anyway,
I do want to say, and I haven't done any studies on this. Maybe you two might know. I don't know if Detroit reads this stuff, but how is the case for saying that relative identity is to be that's what the church fathers were onto all this time? How is that case strong?
I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I think that I've been using the one example this whole time, but I mean, I'm sure we can actually dig into the works of the church fathers and use more examples. But I think Gregory of Nissa and the way he explains it is just so clear that he had nothing like relative identity in mind at all. It's just, if you read first of all, I think it's pretty interesting that the way he sets up the dilemma is like, okay, if the Trinity is true, it's three gods, or else the Son and the Holy Spirit are not God. And it's like, well, that's exactly the kind of like LPT and counting problem we're dealing with today. So that shows, and that's what I was kind of harping on. I think this is something that we should do more often, is that it shows that this is not like, because Trinitarians try to play this game where and Danny mentioned it earlier, it's like a professional gaslighting tactic where they'll just tell you, well, you don't really have the Holy Spirit, or you don't really understand what the Trinity is, or you don't really know this or that, or blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, Gregory of Nissa in the 4th century, when I believe that the doctrine of the Trinity was kind of birthed, that's a separate historical argument, but Gregory of Nissa is responding to a bishop in the church who is asking a question about this problem. And he's like, how do I deal with this? How do I solve this problem? So this is a bishop to another, sort of superior, at least he saw it that way, in knowledge, another bishop in the church. And he's asking him, like, how do I deal with this problem? He doesn't respond by saying, hey, dude, it's simple. Don't you just know relative identity logic? Or don't you just know this? Or don't you know that person and being are 2 different categories?
Do you even know what an identity operator is?
Yeah, like he's not, Gregory doesn't respond that way at all. He's like, listen, first of all, I want to tell you, thank you basically for asking this question. You're doing a good job in being a soldier and, trying to defend the truth and so on and so forth. And then he sets up the argument. Like, this isn't Jake's construction. Trinitarians get mad when I give the human example of Peter, James, and John. Well, excuse me. This is what Gregory of Nissa did in his work on Not Three Gods. He says, well, the argument is something like this. Well, Peter, James, and John each share one nature, human nature, and yet we still don't forbid men to count them by the plural number in the category that they are. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but it says something of this sort. So he's like saying, well, if we call them 3 men, why do we forbid people to say that there's 3 gods? So Gregory, he really kind of understands the problem and what's going on. And before he goes into his, what I think is a ridiculous response, he says, the question that you ask is very difficult to deal with. Right. So when Christians go and try to gaslight us and say, no, this is an easy problem to deal with. Metaphysics, Mike or Jake or Danny and Troy, you guys are just like disbelievers and you don't have the Holy Spirit, or you just don't understand, or you're misrepresenting what we believe. No, none of this is valid at all. And Gregory doesn't just simply appeal to some simple kind of formal solution of relative identity or anything else. He tries to give an answer. Now, I think it's ridiculous, but at least he's really trying to deal with the problem here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I also would expect, because there are certain identity paradoxes that did exist or were talked about before their time. If they were talking about the intricacies of identity and this kind of, maybe their identity is more complicated than we think, you would expect them to bring up diachronic, the diachronic stuff.
All the way back to Aristotle and the Greeks.
The ship of Theseus stuff. You would think that, look, there's ways of getting identity and difference, but I don't see this anywhere, right? But I'm not as well read on the fathers as well as maybe someone else on the panel. But
yeah.
I haven't seen it at all. I mean, I think that we could probably give more examples of the fathers trying to deal with these problems and kind of stack it up, and it'll be more evidence. But I haven't seen anything to the contrary. I have not seen any of them try to deal with it in this kind of, way that Nick or any of these people are with this relative identity. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we've sort of beaten this dead horse a lot now, I guess, but it seems obvious that they were wrestling with serious issues, and people still are wrestling with these issues. Maybe it's intractable. Maybe there's no solution. Maybe we have good reason to think that there isn't one. But even if there is one, it's a difficult problem. It's not something that's solved by the string of symbols that Nick put on his screen. That's just
it's a pretty obvious conclusion. I got to go eat. Sorry, my wife's cooking, so I can't miss that.
I have to go soon too, but
or there will no longer be 2 humans. There will only be 1 human if I don't get that dinner. So I appreciate you having me on the channel.
Yeah, Mike, do you have anything quickly? Any kind of last thoughts, and then we'll kind of just close it down?
Well, what was just said, I thought was so true. Right? They were constantly responding to disputes prior generations couldn't resolve, formulating doctrine more precisely than before, and even condemning views which were once held by respected bishops, right? So I just, it's so true. I'm with it. Thanks for having me on. Great job in the debate. And Yeah, it's good.
All right, Mike, and if you can do me a favor, send me a message on Twitter, X. I'd like to connect with you there.
All right, sounds good.
Okay. And then, guys, thanks for coming on and listening to my ramblings and you know, giving your 2 cents. I appreciate that. Some people, I just do want to say this before we end, though. Some people may be wondering, why did Jake, you have 2 atheists on and a Unitarian Christian? Well, I mean, if I just sat up here with 2 of my, you know, like favorite Muslim buddies or apologists, and we just all kind of laughed about how silly Nick sounded, I don't think it would be as constructive or beneficial for the audience. So I thought this was a better way of doing it. And as opposed to what he did, sitting there with Jay Dyer and Than, even though Jay actually wound up telling him that his position that he represented in the debate was heretical. So Nick needs to repent. But anyway, I just thought that this would be an interesting way of doing it. Normally, I kind of do it solo, but I think this was cool. So I had fun.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks, and I'll see you all again next time. Take care.
Thanks. Oh, and if people want to see more of me, is my channel, Friction.